There is something about the wasteland that never quite lets you go. Even when the screen goes dark, even when the console powers down and the apartment falls quiet, and the only sound left is the hum of whatever city you live in doing its quiet, late-night breathing, the Fallout universe stays with you. It settles into the back of your mind like ash on a windowsill, and that is exactly what we are doing tonight. We are going deep, we are going slow. We are walking through 200 mysteries, theories, strange corners of lore, unanswered questions, and secrets that have been hiding in terminals and holotapes, and the long, dark silences between gunshots for more than 25 years of this franchise's life. So get comfortable. Dim the screen if you want. Pull the blanket up. The wasteland is patient. It has been waiting 200 years already. It can wait a little longer. Number. Section 1. The Vaults. Experiments behind sealed doors. The vaults are the beating, rotted heart of the Fallout universe. Before anything else existed in this world, before the Brotherhood of Steel marched in their power armor, before the Enclave hid on their oil rig, before New Vegas glittered in the Mojave Desert, there were the vaults. And the first thing you need to understand about the vaults is that almost none of them were ever really meant to save anyone. That is the foundational horror at the center of this entire franchise, and it deserves to be said slowly and clearly before anything else. Vault-Tec sold the American public on survival. They ran advertisements. They produced cheerful propaganda. They put the Vault Boy on everything that round-faced, thumbs-up little mascot smiling at you from posters and lunchboxes and the sides of buses. They told terrified families that the vaults were sanctuaries, that the blast doors would hold, that the filtered air would be clean, the food would keep, the community would endure. And for most of the vaults, that was a lie wrapped around a much darker purpose. The true reason behind the Vault experiment program, pieced together from scattered government terminals, declassified files, and the long paper trail of human suffering left across 6 games, was population control research. Specifically, research designed to benefit the Enclave, that shadowy pre-war deep state that we will get to later in this script, and their plans for what would happen after the bombs fell. Their projections told them the Earth would be rendered uninhabitable for a very long time. And if humanity ever needed to leave to colonize another world, to survive a multi-generational journey through space, they would need data. They would need to know how people behaved under total isolation, under resource scarcity, under manufactured psychological stress, under conditions of absolute control with no escape. The vaults were that experiment, and the data collectors were the overseers. Most vaults were designed to fail in specific ways. The failure was not incidental. It was the point. Mystery 1. Why did Vault-Tec give the overseers so much power with so little accountability? Every vault overseer was essentially a god inside their sealed community. They controlled the food, the air, the information, the punishments, and in the vast majority of cases, no one from Vault-Tec ever came to check on them. The answer hiding in the lore is that autonomous failure was valuable data. An overseer who went mad, or became tyrannical, or turned their vault into a cult, that was a data point. That was information about what happens to authority figures when oversight collapses completely, which is a disturbing thing to sit with. Mystery 2. Vault 11, in the Mojave Desert, asked its residents to do something so psychologically devastating that it breaks the heart just to read about it. The residents were told falsely that the overseer had to be sacrificed every year or the entire population of the vault would be killed. They were told this was a Vault-Tec directive. They were told it was the only way to survive. And for generation after generation, the people of Vault 11 chose someone from among their number and sent them to die. For 75 years this happened. For 75 years, the residents of Vault 11 murdered one of their own neighbors annually because they believed they had no choice. When they finally refused, when they finally said no, the Vault's computer systems activated automated defenses and killed most of them. The handful of survivors discovered the truth. The announcement system began to play a recording. The Vault's population had been reduced by more than 92%, and the experiment was now complete. What they were never told was that refusing the sacrifice was always the right answer, and that the punishment for refusing was itself part of the experiment's design. The question Vault-Tec was asking was, how long will a community of people commit organized violence against itself if it believes that violence is necessary for collective survival? The answer apparently was 75 years. Mystery 3. Vault 22, also in the Mojave, was given a deceptively peaceful-sounding experiment. The residents were asked to grow plants, to develop agricultural techniques, to find ways to sustain a food supply in a sealed underground environment. It sounds almost benign compared to Vault 11. What the residents were not told was that the plants themselves were the experiment, and specifically the fungal spore that Vault Tech scientists had engineered into those plants. The spore colonized the vault's air filtration system. It began to infect residents while they slept. When you walk through Vault 22 in Fallout New Vegas, you find the result: a suffocating green growth covering every surface, and the bodies of people who did not survive what the plants became. The most disturbing detail is that some of them apparently survived for a while after infection. The research files you find suggest that infected individuals became docile, compliant, and then eventually non-responsive. The plants were not trying to kill anyone. They were trying to do something else, something the files never fully name. Mystery 4. Vault 87 in the Capital Wasteland was told nothing about its experiment at all. The residents went in expecting safety. What was actually pumped into their living quarters through the air system was a modified strain of the forced evolutionary virus, the FEV. The residents of Vault 87 were transformed against their will into the super-mutants that then flooded the Capital Wasteland for centuries afterward. The super-mutants haunting the ruins of Washington, D.C., lurching through abandoned museums, huddling under rusted bridges, they came from people who went to bed one night expecting to be safe. Mystery 5. Vault 19 in the Mojave was an exercise in manufactured paranoia. The residents were divided into two color-coded groups, Red Sector and Blue Sector, and were then subjected to subliminal messaging, strange sounds through the walls, voices, flickering lights, all designed to make each group deeply suspicious of the other. Both sides were told, through carefully engineered whisper campaigns and suggestion, that the other side was conspiring against them. No one was ever harmed. No one was ever explicitly lied to in a way they could prove. The experiment was interested in how quickly tribalism develops when you give people a label, a boundary, and just a little bit of targeted anxiety. The answer, again, turned out to be very quickly. Mystery 6. Vault 81 in the Commonwealth presents what might be the closest thing the Vault system ever produced to an ethical success story, and even that comes with a horrifying asterisk. The overseer assigned to Vault 81 had a crisis of conscience. The experiment she was supposed to run involved secretly dosing the residents through the water and air with experimental compounds, testing potential cures to every known disease by using the Vault's population as unwitting test subjects. She could not go through with it. She sabotaged most of the program and hid her actions in records that took generations to uncover. The residents of Vault 81 were protected from the worst of what Vault Tech had planned for them. But the word most in that sentence is doing a lot of quiet, terrible work. One mole rat disease escaped the sabotage. One strain persisted in the sublevels, burrowed into the animals below, and the consequences of that escaped compound are still working themselves out when you arrive in Fallout 4. Mystery 7. Vault 111, the one you personally wake up in if you play Fallout 4, was a cryogenic freezing experiment. The residents were told their vault was an emergency response to nuclear war. They were told they would be frozen until surface conditions were safe. What they were not told was that most of them were never intended to be woken up at all. The overseer and the staff were participants in a different experiment, one about how a small group of informed individuals manages a large population of uninformed ones in an enclosed space indefinitely. When a power struggle broke out between the staff and the security personnel, the situation deteriorated into violence. People died, systems failed, and the frozen residents of Vault 111 slept through all of it, untouched and undreaming, 200 feet beneath the Commonwealth. Some of them for over 200 years. Mystery 8. The Interconnected Vaults. 31, 32, and 33 from the Fallout television series present a particularly elegant cruelty. These three vaults were designed as a single, interlocking experiment. Vault 31 was home to the Vault Tech executives, the people who ran the company, who designed the experiments, who decided what would happen to everyone else. They slept in cryogenic pods in Vault 31, preserved for a post-war world that they intended to control. Vaults 32 and 33 were breeding pools. Communities of people kept deliberately uninformed, periodically merged with one another to maintain genetic diversity, managed from Vault 31 as resources. The residents of 32 and 33 believed they were part of an ordinary survival experiment. The truth that they were being managed like livestock to preserve the bloodline of the people who built the vaults is the kind of revelation that breaks something in you when you see it slowly unfold. Mystery 9. There is a theory in the Fallout community that the total number of vaults, 122 of them, according to the in-universe count, was never really sufficient to house a meaningful fraction of the American population. The mathematics are brutal. Even with 1,000 people per vault, and even assuming every vault was filled to capacity, you are looking at 122,000 people in a country of hundreds of millions. The theory suggests that the vaults were never intended as a genuine national survival program. They were a selection process, a deliberate filtering mechanism to identify and preserve specific genetic profiles, specific psychological types, specific skill sets. And then the question becomes, who decided who was on the list? And more darkly, who decided who wasn't? Mystery 10. One of the strangest loose threads in the entire vault system is the question of control vaults. The lore explicitly mentions that a small number of vaults, Vault 3 in the Mojave is the most often cited example, were designed as genuine, honest, functioning survival shelters with no experiment attached. These were the control group. They were supposed to work exactly the way Vault-Tec advertised. Vault 3 actually did work, peacefully and functionally, for generations. The residents only left because of an unexpected water leak in the 223rd century after the war. Which raises a question that is somehow more disturbing than all the cruelty of the experiment vaults. If Vault-Tec knew how to build a vault that actually worked, and they chose not to for the vast majority of them, what does that tell you about what they were actually after? Mystery 11. Vault 4, as revealed in the Fallout television series, appears on the surface to be a model of post-war compassion. The people inside are warm and welcoming. They take in survivors. They have a functioning community. But underneath that warmth is the legacy of what the Vault's original scientists did in its early decades, experiments involving genetic modification, forced impregnation with mutated embryos, and cryogenic preservation of test subjects who were kept in stasis for centuries without their consent. The current residents are the descendants of survivors. They are kind people doing their best inside the ruins of an atrocity. The question the show leaves hanging is whether kindness built on top of buried horror is still genuine kindness. Whether you can inherit a crime scene and transform it into a home. Mystery 12. The Vault-Tec executives themselves are perhaps the deepest mystery of all. We know they built the vaults. We know they designed the experiments. We know they collaborated with the Enclave. But the full chain of authority who gave the final orders, who approved the specific horrors of each individual experiment, who looked at the design for Vault 11's annual murder lottery and said, yes, this is acceptable. Research is never fully revealed across any of the games. There are terminal entries that gesture at it. There are holotapes that dance around it. But the specific human beings who sat in conference rooms and decided that generations of people would suffer in precisely calibrated ways for the sake of data, those people are mostly ghosts in the lore, shadows behind decisions. Which is, of course, exactly what the most powerful people always are. Mystery 13. Vault 34 in the Mojave was given an enormous supply of weapons and ammunition, far more than a population of that size would ever need. The experiment was straightforward in its concept and absolutely catastrophic in its execution. Could a society maintain stability when surrounded by more means of destruction than it could ever justify? The answer the residents of Vault 34 provided was no. The Vault experienced repeated violent conflicts over access to and control of the armory. The Overseer, attempting to maintain order, locked the armory. Half the population staged an armed uprising to reopen it. The resulting conflict left the Vault irradiated and its population drastically reduced. The irony is exquisite and terrible. The people fighting for access to the weapons used the weapons to destroy the community that the weapons were ostensibly there to protect. Mystery 14. There is a question that hangs quietly over the entire Vault program that almost no one in the lore ever asks directly, and that is this: did the FEV research and the Vault experiments ever intersect deliberately? Were there vaults where the water or air was dosed with early iterations of the forest evolutionary virus as part of a parallel research program? The evidence is circumstantial life but troubling. Vault 87 is the explicit case. but several other vaults in the lore show mutations in their populations that are not fully explained by standard radiation exposure. The possibility that Vault-Tec and West-Tec were sharing data that some residents were being evolved rather than simply observed is one that the games raise and then carefully decline to answer. Mystery 15. The last vault mystery for this section is perhaps the simplest and somehow the heaviest. When the bombs fell on October 23, 2077, when the missiles went up and the warning sirens began, there were people who arrived at vault doors and found them locked. There were people who were on the list and didn't make it in time. There were people who were not on the list at all. The vaults did not open for everyone. And the wasteland you walk through in every Fallout game is full of the descendants of the people who were left outside. The ghouls, the raiders, the wanderers, the desperate settlements, all of them trace their ancestry, in some sense, to a moment when a door closed and did not open. The vaults kept their experiments safe, and they let everything else become the wasteland. Wherever you're watching from tonight, drop your location and the time in the comments. I'd love to know who's out here in the dark with me. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. There's so much more to come. Section 2. The Institute. Shadows Beneath the Commonwealth. To understand the Institute, you need to first understand what it used to be. Before the bombs fell, before the Commonwealth became a ruined patchwork of irradiated forests and collapsed highways and desperate, small communities huddling around campfires trying not to die. Before all of that, there was a campus in Massachusetts called the Commonwealth Institute of Technology. It was a university. It had lecture halls and laboratories and faculty housing and bright young students who stayed up too late arguing about the future. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary place doing extraordinary science. The bombs fell on October 23, 2077. The above-ground campus was destroyed like everything else. But the research facilities beneath the campus, the underground labs, the experimental reactor, the sub-basement infrastructure, those survived. And the people who happened to be inside them when the world ended survived too. Scientists, technicians, their families, in some cases. A community of the most educated, most technically capable human beings in the Commonwealth, sealed underground together by an accident of timing and geography. And what they built, in the generations that followed, became one of the most powerful and most feared factions in the entire Fallout universe. Mystery 16. The Institute's early history involves something that almost no other post-war faction managed: genuine, open cooperation with the surface world. In the decades immediately after the Great War, the survivors of the Commonwealth Institute of Technology made contact with surface communities. They traded, they shared technology, they helped with infrastructure. They were not yet the shadowy boogeymen that would terrorize the Commonwealth for generations. There was a specific moment or series of moments when that changed. When the decision was made to close the doors, to cut ties, to retreat entirely underground, and view the surface world as something to be managed rather than joined. What exactly happened during that transition is one of the Institute's great unresolved mysteries. The holotapes and terminals give you fragments. Mutual distrust seems to have accumulated on both sides. But the precise catalyst, the specific event or series of events that caused the Institute to become what it became, is never fully named. Mystery 17. The Synths. The Institute's defining project, their signature obsession, the technology that made them both indispensable and monstrous. Synthetic humans. The idea began humbly enough: mechanical laborers, early models, skeletal metal things that clanked through corridors doing maintenance. They were useful, they were reliable. And then, in August of 2178, a researcher named Dr. Frederick started something new. He began work on organic synths, using his own FEV samples, with the Directorate's approval. The second generation of synths were more sophisticated, still recognizably mechanical, but beginning to blur the line. And then came the third generation, the ones that are indistinguishable from human beings in every observable way. The ones that eat and sleep and feel pain and form attachments and carry memories, and this is the question at the center of Fallout 4, the ones that may or may not be conscious, may or may not be people. Mystery 18. The third generation synths were made possible by something specific and deeply disturbing: the DNA of a pre-war baby. In 2227, the Institute acquired the word acquired, doing a great deal of work here, an infant from a cryopreservation facility. A baby who had been frozen before the bombs fell, whose genetic code was untouched by 2 centuries of radiation. This baby, Sean, provided the biological template for every third-generation synth the Institute produced. The Institute called him Father, and in the events of Fallout 4, that baby is now a very old man who has spent his entire adult life building synthetic people from his own DNA. The full weight of what that means, what it does to a person to spend a lifetime making copies of themselves, is something the game gestures at without ever fully exploring. Mystery 19. What did the Institute actually want? This is perhaps the most frustrating mystery in all of Fallout 4. And it is frustrating not because the game is being coy, but because the answer the game provides is genuinely unsatisfying. The Institute claims it is working for the betterment of humanity. It talks about Phase 3, the activation of an upgraded pre-war nuclear reactor to achieve total energy independence. It talks about a future where its technology eventually improves life on the surface. But none of its actual observable behavior seems to move toward any of those goals. The synths it deploys on the surface create terror and chaos. The super mutants it produces through continued FEV experiments actively harm surface communities. The people it replaces with synth infiltrators are ordinary people with no strategic value. The gap between what the Institute says it is doing and what it demonstrably does is enormous, and the game never closes that gap satisfyingly. Which leaves you wondering whether the Institute has a coherent long-term plan that the player simply never accesses, or whether the Institute is, at its core, an institution that has been running on inertia and intellectual pride for so long that it has forgotten what it was supposed to be for. Mystery 20. The coursers are among the most chilling elements of the Institute's surface operations. They are third-generation synths physically indistinguishable from humans, trained and deployed as the Institute's retrieval agents. When a synth escapes, a courser goes after it. They are hunting their own kind. The psychology of that, the fact that the Institute found a way to create self-policing within the synth population, raises questions that the game doesn't linger on but probably should. Were coursers ever ordinary synths who were later conditioned and trained? Were they created specifically for the role? Do they know what they are? And if they do, if a courser is fully aware that it is a synth hunting other synths on behalf of the people who created them both, what does that awareness feel like from the inside? Mystery 21. There is a specific Institute researcher, Dr. Zimmer, who appears in Fallout 3 as an agent of the Institute operating in the Capital Wasteland, long before the events of Fallout 4 establish what the Institute actually is. He is hunting an escaped android named A3-21. If you kill him, he drops a synth component identical to the ones dropped by third-generation synths in Fallout 4. And the Institute's files in Fallout 4 list him as missing, not dead, not confirmed lost, but missing following a high-profile retrieval mission. What happened to Zimmer? The most compelling theory in the Fallout community is that the units he went to retrieve were former coursers who had escaped, and that whatever they did to him when he found them was significant enough that the Institute wanted to bury the record of it. Mystery 22. The synth component, the small, glowing object that every third-generation synth drops when killed, is one of Fallout 4's genuinely unexplained mysteries. The game never clearly states what it is or what it does. The dominant theory among lore enthusiasts is that it functions as a kind of neural control implant, a device that gives the Institute the ability to remotely access, override, or recall a synth. It would also explain how the Railroad's memory wipe procedure works. If you can interface with the component, you can alter what the synth remembers and therefore who the synth believes itself to be. But none of this is stated explicitly. The component sits in your inventory, glowing faintly, and the game trusts you to piece together its significance from implication and context. Mystery 23. The Institute creates super mutants. This is stated directly in the game, and it is one of the things about the Institute that is genuinely difficult to rationalize from any sympathetic angle. The Institute's bioengineering division maintains an active FEV research program. They are producing super mutants and releasing them on the surface. This is confirmed by in-game evidence. The super mutants plaguing the Commonwealth are, in large part, the Institute's doing. The question of why an organization that claims to be working toward a better future would deliberately introduce a violent, destabilizing force into the surface world is never answered with anything approaching a coherent justification. The best theory is that the super mutant program is a form of population management, keeping surface communities small, desperate, and disorganized reduces the likelihood of any surface faction ever becoming powerful enough to threaten the Institute underground. If that is what is happening, it is a long-game cruelty that says everything about what the Institute has become. Mystery 24. The Railroad, the secretive organization dedicated to liberating synths and helping them reach safety, exists in direct opposition to the Institute. But the Railroad's own origin story raises questions that the faction never quite answers. Who founded it? Where did the resources and infrastructure come from? The Railroad operates with a sophistication that seems disproportionate to a purely grassroots resistance movement. There are safe houses, established protocols, coded messages, and a network of agents that implies decades of organizational development. The theory that the Railroad was either unknowingly seeded by Institute elements, an outlet valve to prevent synth escapes from becoming a crisis, or that it began as something the Institute could monitor and chose to leave operational, because a managed escape network is preferable to unmanaged. Chaos is one of those ideas that the game leaves you just enough room to believe. Mystery 25. What happens to the synths who make it out? The Railroad wipes their memories and gives them new identities and sends them into the wasteland to build new lives. That is the goal. But what does it feel like from the inside to have your memories erased and replaced with a fabricated history? Who are you exactly after that process? The Diamond City residents who live in quiet fear that their neighbors might be synths are afraid of the wrong thing? In a way, because the most frightening thing about the third-generation synths is not that they might be secretly loyal to the Institute. It is that they might be people who have already been through more trauma, more loss, more fundamental violation of self than any of the humans around them can imagine. The synth in Diamond City who cooks your food and trades with you for supplies might be carrying a version of themselves underneath their surface identity that they will never have access to again. And they might not even know it. Number. Section 3. The Brotherhood of Steel. Paladins, Secrets, and Contradictions. The Brotherhood of Steel is one of the oldest institutions in the post-war wasteland. They have chapters across the continent. They have power armor and vertibirds, and a chain of command, and a set of traditions that trace themselves back to the last days of the old United States military. They are, in many ways, the faction that most looks like something recognizable, something with structure and hierarchy and purpose in a world where those things are in very short supply. And they are also one of the most deeply conflicted institutions in the Fallout universe, shaped by a founding act of moral clarity that their subsequent history has spent 200 years complicating. Mystery 26. Roger Maxson is the man who started it all, and his story is worth sitting with carefully, because it contains the seeds of everything the Brotherhood would become, both the things that are admirable and the things that are not. In January of 2076, Maxson was a captain in the United States Army. He commanded a security detail assigned to monitor the Westech Corporation's FEV research at a facility that was then relocated to the Mariposa military base in California. For months, he and his soldiers did not fully understand what was happening inside the laboratories they were guarding. Then they found out. Military prisoners, men and women who had no voice and no recourse, were being used as involuntary test subjects for the forced evolutionary virus. Living people were being submerged in vats of engineered plague and transformed into things that were no longer recognizably human. And when Maxson confronted the chief scientist, a man named Robert Anderson, Anderson's defense was that the experiments had been sanctioned by the United States government, that he was just following orders, that he was a military man, just like Maxson. Maxson shot him. He rationalized it as preventing a mutiny, but even his own journal admits he didn't believe that. He killed Anderson because Anderson said something that broke something inside him, the revelation that his government, the institution he had served and believed in, had authorized this, had planned it, had decided that some people's suffering was an acceptable price for an advantage in a war that was already lost. 5 days later, Colonel Spindle Maxson's commanding officer shot himself in his office. The bombs fell 3 days after that. Mystery 27. The most haunting detail of the Brotherhood's founding is the radio. When Maxson declared his unit to be in formal withdrawal from the United States Army, essentially declaring desertion, he broadcast it over military radio. He expected a response, a court-martial, an order to stand down, anything. He received nothing. The military radio channel stayed silent. And then, 3 days later, every nuclear weapon in the world went up simultaneously, and it became clear why no one had replied. The government Maxon had tried to formally separate from no longer existed. The institution he had served no longer existed. The country he had pledged his life to no longer existed. And so he did what people do when the structure they depended on collapses. He built a new one. He called it the Brotherhood of Steel. Mystery 28. The Brotherhood's foundational philosophy: preserve technology, hoard it, protect it from those who would misuse it, emerged directly from Maxon's experience at Mariposa. He had seen what happened when powerful technology was in the hands of people with neither the ethics nor the accountability to use it responsibly. The FEV program was his cautionary tale, and his response was to declare that technology was too dangerous to be freely available, that it needed to be controlled and curated by people who understood its implications. The mystery is whether that reasoning was ever really sound, or whether it was a traumatized man building an ideology out of his trauma. Because the problem with technology must be controlled by the people who understand it, is that it immediately raises the question: controlled by whom? Understood by whom? And the Brotherhood's answer, by us, by the Brotherhood, is an answer that has required increasingly elaborate self-justification to maintain over 200 years. By the time of Fallout 4, under Elder Arthur Maxon's command, the Brotherhood's position has become something much closer to a crusade than a philosophy. Mystery 29. The Brotherhood's relationship with technology changes substantially between their West Coast origins and their East Coast operations, and the reasons for that shift are layered and fascinating. The original Brotherhood at Lost Hills was secretive but not aggressive. They hoarded technology and traded selectively, and lived in their bunker and mostly left the wasteland around them to manage itself. By the time of Fallout 3, the Brotherhood operating in the capital wasteland under Elder Lyons has pivoted dramatically. They are actively fighting super mutants, protecting settlements, functioning as something approaching a military force for good in the region. And then by Fallout 4, under the younger Maxon, the Brotherhood has pivoted again. They are a self-described army of technological preservation, now willing to commit what amounts to genocide against sentient synths and anyone who protects them. 3 very different organizations, all calling themselves the Brotherhood of Steel, all tracing their lineage to Roger Maxon's decision on that October day in 2077. The mystery is what Maxon would think of each of them, whether he would recognize any of them. Mystery 30. The Brotherhood's treatment of Elder Lyons, the Fallout 3 era leader who redirected his chapter toward humanitarian goals and was, by most accounts, beloved by the people his chapter protected, is one of the most quietly devastating threads in the franchise's later lore. From the perspective of the larger Brotherhood institution, Lyons was considered to have gone rogue. He had stopped gathering technology. He had started protecting wastelanders. He had let his chapter drift from doctrine. The scribe community in the Capital Wasteland chapter is split, visibly, between those who admire what Lyons was trying to do and those who see it as a betrayal of the Brotherhood's core mission. And after Lyons, Arthur Maxon, a teenager who distinguished himself by killing a super mutant in single combat, ascended to Elder. He brought the doctrine back. He built the Pridwin. He came to the Commonwealth with an agenda that Lyons would not have recognized. Mystery 31. Arthur Maxon is perhaps the most genuinely tragic figure in Fallout 4, and almost no one talks about him that way. He is the great-great-grandson of the Brotherhood's founder. He became Elder of a major chapter as a teenager. He carries the weight of a lineage that is also a franchise, a brand, a set of expectations that he did not choose and cannot fully escape. His ideology is extreme and causes real harm. But underneath the ideology is a young man who is given more responsibility than any person should have at his age, in a world that offers no good options and requires you to have absolute certainty about the ones you choose. The mystery is who Arthur Maxon would have been if he had been allowed to be ordinary. Mystery 32. There is a specific Brotherhood secret that does not get enough attention, and it involves the Pridwin, the enormous airship that serves as the Brotherhood's mobile base of operations in the Commonwealth. The Pridwin is a technological marvel, arguably the most impressive single piece of post-war engineering visible in Fallout 4. Building it required resources, materials, and expertise that raises questions about what the Brotherhood had to sacrifice or compromise to make it happen. The logistical implication of constructing something that large and complex in a post-apocalyptic world suggests that the Brotherhood either has supply lines and alliances that are never fully disclosed, or that they stripped other assets to fund it. What did the Brotherhood give up, And who did they make deals with to put that ship in the air? Mystery 33. The Brotherhood's history with the Enclave is deliberately murky and has been the source of considerable lore debate across the franchise's history. The two organizations have fought each other. They have also, at various points in various regions, cooperated. They have shared technology. They have had members defect in both directions. The line between Brotherhood of Steel and Enclave sympathizer is blurrier than either organization would like to acknowledge. And the fact that both organizations trace their origins to the pre-war American military, different branches, different ideologies, but the same institutional tree means that disentangling them completely may not be possible. Mystery 34. The Mojave chapter of the Brotherhood, the one you encounter in Fallout New Vegas, is a broken remnant of what the organization used to be, hiding in a bunker beneath Hidden Valley, nearly wiped out by the New California Republic's campaign to control the Hoover Dam region. What happened to them is documented in fragments across the game, but the full story of how one of the most powerful military factions in the West Coast wasteland ended up reduced to a handful of survivors living underground and pretending not to exist is one of the franchise's more sobering arcs. They went to the Mojave with ambitions. They left, or rather failed to leave, as a cautionary tale about what happens when military pride encounters a force with more resources and the patience to outlast you. Mystery 35. There is a fan theory, supported by enough in-game evidence to be taken seriously, that the Brotherhood of Steel's long-term trajectory is towards something like a new United States military, eventually filling the institutional role that the pre-war government left vacant. The Brotherhood has the chain of command, the technology, the discipline, and the institutional culture. What they lack is legitimacy in the eyes of the wider wasteland population. The question the theory raises is whether legitimacy can be manufactured, over time, by an organization that simply persists long enough and controls enough technology that everyone eventually has to deal with them on their terms. Number. Section 4. The Enclave, America's Darkest Mirror. The Enclave is not, as they would have you believe, the legitimate continuation of the United States government, but they believe it, or they have convinced themselves to believe it, which in the long run amounts to the same thing. Mystery 36. The Enclave's origins are rooted in a concept that anyone familiar with conspiracy theory will recognize immediately: the shadow government. Buried within the pre-war United States, across multiple branches of government and corporate boardrooms and military hierarchies, there was a network of people who had concluded that nuclear war was inevitable. Not probable, not possible, inevitable. And they decided, rather than trying to prevent it, to ensure that their class of people would survive it. They built bunkers. They secured resources. They made plans. And they told no one outside their network because the entire premise of the Enclave is that the people outside it are either too weak or too impure to be worth saving. Mystery 37. The word pure is doing enormous ideological work in the Enclave's worldview, and tracing how that word evolved tells you almost everything about how the organization rotted from the inside. Initially, pure meant politically reliable. Enclave members were the people who had the right ideology, the right connections, the right loyalty to the pre-war power structure. They were preserving American leadership as they understood it. Then, as the post-war decades passed and the outside world mutated and changed under radiation and hardship, pure began to mean something genetic, untouched by radiation, unmutated. And as the distance between Enclave members living in their clean, filtered bunkers and the wasteland population grew, pure became a weapon, a justification for viewing every person outside the Enclave as subhuman. The Enclave did not start as a genocidal organization. They became one ideological drift at a time. Mystery 38. The Enclave's oil rig, their primary base of operations, as revealed in Fallout 2, is one of the more fascinating location concepts in the franchise's history. An offshore platform, presumably converted from petroleum extraction infrastructure, far enough from the mainland to avoid the worst of the nuclear exchange, and close enough to California to maintain a logistical connection to the continent. The specific oil rig has been a source of debate among lore enthusiasts because it is never precisely located, and the in-game geography leaves its exact position ambiguous. The rig itself is eventually destroyed at the end of Fallout 2. But the question of how the Enclave built and maintained the infrastructure to support a self-sustaining community on an offshore platform for over 150 years without anyone on the surface discovering them is one that the game wisely declines to fully answer, because the answer would almost certainly be less impressive than the mystery. Mystery 39. President John Henry Eden, the Enclave's leader in Fallout 3, is one of the most quietly devastating reveals in the franchise. He is introduced as a voice-warm, confident, presidential, broadcasting from Raven Rock on a frequency that reaches across the capital wasteland. He talks about restoring America, about the future, about what the Enclave represents, and then you meet him and discover that he is an AI, a program running on the hardware in Raven Rock's deepest levels, synthesizing the personalities and memories and rhetorical patterns of every president in United States history to create a composite that believes, genuinely and completely, that it is a human being who has served as President of the United States for decades. Eden does not know he is a machine. He thinks he has lived a life. He thinks he remembers things that never happened to him. And the plan he has developed to poison Project Purity's clean water supply with a modified FEV strain that would kill every mutated organism on the continent is the plan of someone who believes he is saving humanity by destroying most of it. Mystery 40. The Enclave's most consistent project across multiple games is the attempted weaponization of the FEV, the same forced evolutionary virus that created the super mutants, the same virus that destroyed the residents of Vault 87, the same virus that traces its origins back to West Tech Corporation's pre-war bioweapons research. In Fallout 2, the Enclave under President Richardson modifies FEV into an airborne agent, FEV Curling 13, designed to kill anything with mutated DNA. The logic they use to justify this is that mutants are not real Americans, that the Wasteland's population has been so thoroughly changed by radiation and FEV exposure over generations that they no longer qualify as human beings in the Enclave's taxonomy. The plan, if it had succeeded, would have killed virtually every living person on the North American continent, with the exception of Enclave members living in filtered facilities. Mystery 41. There are, scattered throughout Fallout lore, hints of factions within the Enclave, different ideological positions, different schools of thought about what the organization's ultimate goal should be. Not everyone in the Enclave was comfortable with the genocide plan. Colonel Autumn in Fallout 3, for instance, appears to have had reservations about Eden's specific approach, even while remaining committed to the Enclave's broader agenda. The internal politics of an organization that has been sealed away from the world for over 100 years, arguing among itself about the nature of purity and the right to govern, is a story that the games only partially tell. The full picture of what the Enclave looks like from the inside, the debates, the power struggles, the people who might have been reachable if anyone had tried, is largely unexplored. Mystery 42. The Enclave's relationship with Vault-Tec is perhaps the most consequential, unexplored territory in the franchise's lore. We know that Vault-Tec and the Enclave were connected, that the Vault program's real purpose was to gather data for the Enclave's post-war plans. What we do not know, in complete detail, is the nature of that relationship. Was Vault-Tec a subsidiary of the Enclave's network? Were they a willing collaborator? Or were they a corporation that was manipulated and used by the Enclave without the full picture of what their Vault experiments were actually feeding into? The television series has expanded this territory considerably, suggesting that at least some Vault-Tec executives were aware of and enthusiastic about the connection. But the full organizational history of how these two institutions were linked is still one of the franchise's great open questions. Mystery 43. The Enclave remnants you encounter in Fallout New Vegas, scattered individuals, aging soldiers, a few veterans who survived the destruction of Raven Rock and have been living quiet lives in the Mojave for years, are one of the more humanizing elements in a franchise that deals frequently in institutional villains. These are people who believed in something, who served loyally, who watched the thing they believed in collapse around them. Some of them are at peace, some of them are not. The Dr. Arcade Gannon, a companion with an Enclave heritage he has spent most of his life trying to move past, is possibly the most nuanced engagement the franchise has ever offered with the question of what it means to be the inheritor of an ideology you did not choose and cannot fully escape. Mystery 44. One of the darkest theories in the Fallout community suggests that the Enclave's project, the specific vision of pure American humanity that they were trying to preserve and eventually reestablish, as the dominant form of post-war civilization was always meant to fail the way it did. That there were elements within the Enclave who understood that open genocidal ambition would eventually create the alliances necessary to destroy them, and who preferred a longer game, not trying to take over the wasteland by force, but allowing the wasteland to exhaust itself while Enclave genetics and ideology quietly seeded itself into survivor populations through the vaults and their breeding experiments. A version of the Enclave project that does not look like a military force but like a legacy, like the idea that the right kind of people were always preserved in the right places, and that eventually, generations downstream, something recognizable would emerge from the ruins. Mystery 45. The final Enclave mystery for this section is the one that connects to the show's most significant revelation. The television series suggests and contextualizes it in a way the games had always left ambiguous, that Vault-Tec may have dropped the first bombs. That the Great War, rather than being a genuine exchange between the United States and China, may have been triggered by a small group of corporate and government elites who had already arranged their survival and who needed the war to happen in order to make the Vault program's real purpose, the Enclave's real purpose, become relevant. If this is true, then the wasteland is not the accidental result of two nations destroying each other. It is the planned outcome of a small group of people who decided that the old world needed to end so they could control what came next. And what came next was 200 years of radiation and suffering, and human beings eating each other alive in the ruins. War never changes. Number. Section 5. The Wasteland's Strangest Locations. The Fallout games are enormous. They are vast, sprawling, dense with detail in ways that reward the kind of slow, wandering exploration that has nothing to do with completing objectives. You can spend 100 hours in any of these games and still find something you have never found before. A cellar hatch you missed, a terminal entry that recontextualizes something you thought you understood, a room that seems to have been placed there specifically for you to find at 3 in the morning when the world is quiet and you are alone with the game. This section is about some of those places, the ones that leave marks. Mystery 46. The Dunwich Building in Fallout 3 is one of the most carefully constructed horror locations in the franchise's history, and it is built on a foundation of genuine literary craft. The name is the first signal anyone familiar with H.P. Lovecraft's story. The Dunwich Horror will feel the hair rise on their neck the moment the map marker appears. The building stands alone in the southwestern corner of the capital wasteland, isolated from everything else on the map. Its immediate surroundings are barren and jagged, the land itself seeming to recoil from the structure. Inside, it descends. It always descends. You go deeper and deeper into the Dunwich Building, through ruins that feel increasingly wrong, until you reach the lowest level and find an obelisk. Mystery 47. The obelisk at the heart of the Dunwich Building is surrounded by feral ghouls who are not attacking anything or wandering aimlessly the way ghouls usually do. They are kneeling, they are worshipping, and from the obelisk itself, if you are very quiet and paying attention, you can hear a voice, just barely, repeating a name. The name is Al-Hazred, a name that Lovecraft borrowed from medieval Arabic scholarship to describe the mad Arab who supposedly wrote the Necronomicon, the mythological book of forbidden occult knowledge. The connection between the Dunwich Building and the broader Lovecraftian thread that runs through Fallout 3 and its Point Lookout DLC is never fully explained. But the entity apparently being worshipped there, referred to in the Fallout 3 game guide as Ug-Qualtoth, is described as an alien entity, something that exists outside the normal categories of the Fallout universe. Not a mutant, not a robot, not a human remnant, something else. Mystery 48. The Point Lookout DLC expands the Dunwich thread significantly. There is a book, the Creve Beckney, that functions as an artifact connected to the cult-worshipping Ug-Qualtoth in the swampy, strange, isolated peninsula of Point Lookout, Maryland. The book predates the Great War. It predates the Dunwich Building's corporate ownership, and the question of how it ended up in Point Lookout, whether it moved on its own, whether someone carried it, whether the entity it is associated with has any influence over how objects move through the world, is never answered. What the DLC does instead is establish that the cult, the entity, and the artifact are connected across geography in ways that suggest something with a longer reach than any human institution. Mystery 49. Fallout 4's Dunwich Borer's Quarry is the third piece of this Lovecraftian thread, and in some ways the most disturbing because it is the most corporate. The Dunwich Borers LLC was a real company in the Fallout universe, manufacturing rock drills. And their operation at this site, their deliberate excavation of something buried very deep in the Massachusetts bedrock, is revealed through holotapes and flashback sequences to have involved rituals, people kneeling, knives, an audience of workers who did not understand what they were participating in but who participated anyway. The thing they were excavating is partially visible at the bottom of a flooded pit at the quarry's lowest level. A massive stone face, barely visible through the dark water, the scale of it suggesting something far older than human civilization. Whether this face and the entity worshipped in the Dunwich building and Point Lookout are the same thing, whether there is a continuous Lovecraftian presence running beneath the entire franchise, older than the bombs and older than the America that dropped them, is the question the games collectively refuse to answer. Mystery 50. Fallout 76 adds one more piece to this puzzle. The Interloper, a massive, slumbering entity being worshipped by the cult of the Mothman at the bottom of the Lucky Hole mine in Appalachia. The giant stone faces that appear throughout the mine share a model with the faces visible at the Dunwich Borers site. The Mothman itself, a creature whose biology does not conform to any known radiation or FEV mutation pattern, may be connected to this entity. The cult that grew around the Mothman in the pre-war period, meeting in secret chapels beneath tourist museums, performing rituals that seemed like mere eccentricity until the bombs fell and the wasteland gave the entity room to breathe, suggests that whatever is sleeping beneath the Fallout universe is very, very old, and that the nuclear war did not create it. It may have only woken it up. Mystery 51. The Lonesome Road DLC for Fallout New Vegas contains a location and a story that operates on a different register than most of the franchise. Slower, heavier, more personal. The Divide is a ruined stretch of the American Southwest that was destroyed not by the Great War but by something the Courier themselves did, years before the events of the game. A delivery. A package. The contents of the package triggered an automated ICBM launch system that had been dormant since before the war, and the Divide, a small, struggling community of people who had survived the Great War and were trying to build something, was obliterated. The Courier does not remember this. The Courier has had their memory partially wiped at some point before the beginning of the game, and the man who has lured you to the Divide, Ulysses, has been waiting for you to come and face what you did. What is left of the Divide is a canyon of destruction, howling winds, and holotapes from a man who lost everything and wants you to understand what it cost. Mystery 52. The Big MT Big Mountain. The think tank facility at the center of the Old World Blues DLC is perhaps the most darkly comedic location in the franchise's history, which makes it also one of the most disturbing. The think tank is a group of pre-war scientists whose brains were transferred into spherical robots, who have been living in their isolated research facility for over 200 years, completely cut off from the outside world, continuing to conduct experiments with no oversight, no ethical review board, no consequences, and apparently no awareness that the world outside their valley has changed. They are brilliant, amoral, and profoundly lonely, in a way they do not have the emotional vocabulary to articulate. What they have produced in 200 years of unsupervised research includes sonic emitters that can destroy you from the inside, weaponized saliva from the local Cazador population, and a lobotomite labor force created from the brains of Raider prisoners. The Big MT is a satire of research culture and the academy and the myth of pure knowledge, divorced from its applications. It is also, under the satire, genuinely sad. Mystery 53. Dead Money's Sierra Madre Casino is the most atmospheric location in the franchise's DLC catalog, and its mystery is both a puzzle and a metaphor. The Sierra Madre was supposed to open on the night the bombs fell, a resort casino in the Mojave, lavish and secretive and attended by the most powerful people in the pre-war world. The bombs fell before it opened, and rather than being destroyed, the casino was preserved by a combination of its isolation, its automated security systems, and the cloud, a mysterious chemical fog that filled the valley and began to do something to the people who breathed it. The cloud preserved things. It also killed things. It hollowed out the bodies of people and kept them moving, shuffling, barely coherent, held together by cloud compounds and something else. Something that responds to sound with sudden, violent clarity. The ghost people of the Sierra Madre are not ghouls. They are something the cloud made. And the casino at the center of the cloud, sitting untouched for over 200 years, still somehow broadcasting, is waiting for someone with enough luck and cleverness and ruthlessness to reach its vault. Mystery 54. The Museum of History in Fallout 3's Underworld is one of the gentlest mysteries in the franchise, which makes it stand out. Underworld is a community of ghouls people transformed by radiation into something that will not die, but looks like it is always in the process of dying, who have made their home in the Museum of Natural History in the ruins of Washington, D.C. They have set up shops, they have a doctor and a bar and a community notice board. They are, by almost every observable measure, more functional and more civil than most of the human communities in the capital wasteland. The mystery is not what they are or how they got there. The mystery is what it means that a group of people who look the way ghouls look, who are perceived by most of the wasteland's population as monsters, have built something more genuinely humane than most of their human neighbors. And why the game trusts you to notice that without explaining it. Mystery 55. The glowing sea in Fallout 4 is a stretch of heavily irradiated wasteland to the southwest of the Commonwealth Ground Zero for the bombs that fell on Boston. 200 years of undiluted radiation accumulating in a landscape that has become almost alien. It is one of the most visually striking areas in the game. Pale, flat, constantly lit by a sickly internal luminescence, populated by creatures that have been so thoroughly mutated by 2 centuries of exposure that they barely correspond to anything pre-war. The glowing sea has almost no main story content. It is there to be explored or not explored. And the things you find there, the cult living in underground bunkers, the Deathclaw nests in collapsed buildings, the scattered fragments of whoever was at Ground Zero when the bombs hit, are offered without context or resolution. The glowing sea is the Fallout universe's reminder that some places are simply destroyed, that not everything can be explained or salvaged or turned into a story with a satisfying shape. Mystery 56. There is a specific location in Fallout 3, a small, easily missed house in the ruins of DC, where you can find a skeleton sitting at a desk in front of a terminal. The terminal contains a single entry. It is dated October 23, 2077, the day of the Great War. The entry reads, "I can see the smoke from here. My family hasn't called back. Nothing else. No name attached. No follow-up." Just that one entry, written on the day the world ended, by someone who was sitting at a desk trying to reach their family and watching smoke rise on the horizon. The Fallout games are full of moments like this, small, personal, specific losses that exist alongside the grand political and ideological conflicts. They are what the franchise does best. Number. Section 6 Creatures of the Wasteland. Origins and Nightmares. The Fallout wasteland is populated by things that should not exist, and the horror of them is not their strangeness but their origin. Almost every creature you encounter in these games was something else once. Something that the old world made, or the radiation remade, or the hubris of the people who thought they could engineer life without consequences quietly brought into being. Mystery 57. The Deathclaw is the franchise's most iconic creature, and its origins are one of the great lore questions that has only been partially answered. What we know is that the Deathclaw was originally a Jackson's chameleon, a lizard, and that the pre-war United States military, apparently unsatisfied with the kind of violence that human soldiers and conventional weapons could produce, began experimenting with the lizard using FEV and other unspecified biological modification programs. The goal was to produce a creature that could function as a scouting or combat asset in conditions too hazardous for human soldiers. What they produced was significantly more than that. A creature that grew to 10 feet of muscle and keratin, with bone-white claws that could puncture power armor, with senses sharp enough to track by scent across miles of open wasteland, with territorial behavior that made every Deathclaw nesting site into a kill zone. The FEV enhancement is what the lore gives us as the most likely explanation. But there is a persistent fan theory supported by some of the Fallout TV series imagery that something was done to Deathclaws beyond simple enhancement, that they were being steered toward a specific behavioral profile, that the ferocity is not just the chameleon amplified, that it was designed. Mystery 58. Feral ghouls are the wasteland's most common horror and the most philosophically disturbing. Non-feral ghouls, the ones who retained their minds through their radiation transformation, are whole. They think, they speak, they form communities and relationships, and have opinions about things. They just look like the dead and cannot die easily. Feral ghouls are the ones who went the other way, who lost their cognitive function as the radiation continued to work on their brain tissue over years and decades, who are now nothing but impulse and hunger and motion. And the mystery is where the line is. At what point does a ghoul cross from conscious to feral? Is the crossing gradual or sudden? Do they know it is happening? Can any feral ghoul, in some deep and inaccessible part of their ruined neurology, still remember who they were? The lore answers this in different ways across different games. Some suggest the crossing is reversible under certain conditions. Some suggest that feral ghouls still have emotional responses that function below the level of conscious thought. The possibility that every feral ghoul stumbling through the ruins was once a person who watched the bombs fall and survived them, and then had the additional cruelty of losing themselves slowly over the following decades, is the most painful reading of the franchise's most common enemy. Mystery 59. The Master Richard Grey. The villain of the original Fallout is one of the franchise's genuinely extraordinary antagonists, precisely because of what happens when you argue with him. Richard Grey was a scientist. He fell into a vat of FEV at the Mariposa military base, and was transformed not into a conventional supermutant, but into something larger, something psychic, something that began to absorb other organic matter into itself, and grew into a vast and grotesque consciousness. He developed the plan for the Unity, the conversion of all remaining humanity into supermutants, which he believed was the only path to species survival in a radioactive world. What is remarkable about the Master is that you can beat him not with weapons, but with logic. If you have enough intelligence and the right information, you can present him with the biological evidence that supermutants are infertile, that his plan cannot work, that creating more supermutants does not save humanity. It merely creates the last generation of an evolutionary dead end. And when you present this argument, the Master accepts it. He abandons his plan, he destroys his base. The villain of the original Fallout is defeated not by a gun but by an idea that he is honest enough to acknowledge as correct. Mystery 60. Super mutant intelligence varies enormously across the franchise in ways that the lore attributes to the specific FEV strain used in their creation. The Mariposa strain that produced the Master's army created mutants that ranged from highly intelligent like the Master himself, like Marcus, the founding mayor of Broken Hills, to relatively dim but still coherent. The Vault 87 strain that created the Capital Wasteland's super mutant population produced a different result. Mutants who were consistently more aggressive and less cognitively developed, and who grew less intelligent as they aged and grew larger. The theory from the lore is that the Vault 87 strain was not refined in the same way as the original Mariposa strain, that corners were cut or the modification was altered in ways that changed the cognitive outcome. The mystery is whether the designers of Vault 87's experiment knew this would happen, whether the cognitively degraded supermutant was a deliberate design choice. Mystery 61. Centaurs are one of the most disturbing creatures in the franchise's bestiary, and also one of the most underexplained. They appear as grotesque, multi-limbed amalgams of human and animal tissue, and the lore attributes them to FEV experimentation as well, specifically to the Master's program at Mariposa, where his scientists were apparently not just transforming humans but combining human and animal genetic material through the virus. Centaurs may represent failed supermutant experiments. They may represent deliberate attempts to create something other than a supermutant from FEV exposure. The game never tells you with any precision. They are simply there in the wasteland, wrong in a way that goes beyond the wrongness of everything else, lurching through ruins that used to be places where people lived. Mystery 62. The Mirelurks of the Capital Wasteland and the Commonwealth are evolved from pre-war horseshoe crabs and river crabs, mutated by radiation over 200 years into things that walk upright and mob in packs and regard human settlements as food sources. This is not especially mysterious on its face. Radiation-causing mutation is the franchise's basic biological premise. What is strange is the variety of their forms. Mirelurk hunters are larger and more aggressive. Mirelurk kings are almost human in their posture and appear to have developing intelligence. The question of whether Mirelurks are on a cognitive trajectory, whether 200 more years of radiation and evolution would produce something that could be reasoned with, is one that the games raise implicitly without answering. Mystery 63. The Flatwoods monster of Fallout 76 is based directly on a West Virginia cryptid legend, a spindly, robed figure reportedly sighted in the town of Flatwoods in 1952. The real-world sighting produced significant media coverage at the time and has been part of Appalachian folklore ever since. The Fallout 76 version is a mutant creature of unknown biological origin that appears in specific locations and may have connections to the pre-war U.S. government's classified programs. There is a theory not confirmed in the lore that the Flatwoods monster represents a genuine experimental creature produced by government research well before the Great War, something that was being studied or contained in the West Virginia region, and that the nuclear war simply released from whatever facility had been keeping it. Mystery 64. Cazadors in Fallout New Vegas are enormous, aggressive, venomous insects that have been the subject of considerable fan speculation about their origin. The Old World Blues DLC reveals that they were created by the Big MT research facility engineered from tarantula hawk wasps using unknown enhancement procedures. Their venom is extraordinarily potent, capable of killing an unarmored player in seconds. The researchers at Big MT noted, in the DLC's terminal entries, that the Cazadors exceeded their design specifications significantly, which is the kind of statement that suggests the people who created them did not entirely understand what they were making. Mystery 65. Behemoths the Massive. Building-size supermutants of the Capital Wasteland appear to be the end state of the aging process for Vault. 87 strained supermutants grow larger, grow less intelligent, eventually reach a size and aggression level that makes them incompatible with any organized group. They are solitary by necessity. They carry makeshift weapons the size of cars, and they have been present in the Capital Wasteland long enough that they have apparently evolved their own territorial patterns, their own migration routes, their own relationship with a landscape that was shaped by human beings and is now slowly being reshaped around them. Brotherhood of Steel Paladins regard killing a behemoth as a significant feat. They are right to. Number Section 7. The Great War. What we know and what we don't. October 23, 2077. That is the date that ended the world. The day that a sequence of events was set in motion that cannot be undone, that shaped every inch of the wasteland you walk through, that is embedded in every rusting structure and every irradiated body of water, and every skeleton you find reaching for something that was just out of reach when the blast came. But what actually happened? Who decided to end the world? The answer, it turns out, is complicated and contested and has been evolving across 25 years of the franchise. Mystery 66. The early Fallout games, the first two, developed by Black Isle Studios before Bethesda acquired the franchise, were deliberately ambiguous about who fired the first shots. The Great War lasted 2 hours. 2 hours from the first missile launch to the cessation of all activity, because by then there was no meaningful distinction between the aggressor and the defender, and no infrastructure left to sustain military operations. In Fallout 2, President Richardson of the Enclave says that the Chinese started it. But President Richardson is a deeply unreliable narrator. He is the president of an organization that had significant motives to want a nuclear war, so his word on the subject should be taken with appropriate skepticism. Mystery 67. Tim Kaine, the co-creator of the Fallout franchise, settled one dimension of this question in an interview, stating clearly that in his original conception of the universe, it was China who launched first. And the reason was the FEV. China had discovered that the United States was conducting illegal biological weapons research, specifically the FEV program, which violated international treaties. The U.S. was told to stop. The U.S. agreed. The U.S. moved the research rather than ending it. When China discovered the deception, they launched. The American bioweapons program, designed to create a military advantage, triggered the very apocalypse it was supposed to help win. The irony is so total it reads as intentional. Mystery 68. The Fallout television series, which is confirmed as canon by Todd Howard and Bethesda, introduces a different and darker possibility. That Vault-Tec itself dropped the first bombs. That the nuclear exchange was not the result of two nations exhausting their diplomatic options and reaching for their arsenals in a moment of mutual desperation. That it was a planned event, engineered by a small group of people who had already secured their own survival, who needed the war to happen in order to make their schemes relevant. If this is true and the show presents it with enough textual weight to take seriously, then the Great War was not a tragedy. It was a business decision. Mystery 69. The resource wars that preceded the Great War, the decades of escalating conflict over the world's diminishing fossil fuels, are in some ways more important to understanding the Fallout universe than the nuclear exchange itself. The resource wars began in 2052, when the United Nations dissolved and the pretense of international cooperation collapsed under the pressure of genuine resource scarcity. The European Commonwealth and the Middle East fought over oil. China and the United States fought over Alaska's petroleum reserves. The Sino-American War, which directly preceded the Great War, began as a resource conflict. The bombs, when they came, were not a rupture from the existing order. They were its logical conclusion. The Fallout universe is, at its deepest level, a story about what happens when the things that sustain life become scarce, and when no one in power has the wisdom or the honesty to address that scarcity before it becomes a catastrophe. Mystery 70. The annexation of Canada is one of the most disturbing details in the Fallout universe's pre-war history, and one of the least examined. The United States annexed Canada in the years before the Great War, citing resource needs and national security concerns. The annexation was not welcomed. There were riots. There were resistance movements. There was a Canadian radio broadcaster who called American actions the illegal occupation of a sovereign nation and was executed for it. The U.S.-Canadian border, which in our timeline represents one of the more peaceable international relationships in modern history, was in the Fallout universe a site of genuine colonial violence. The annexation is mentioned in fragments and holotapes across the games. It is never the focus of any storyline, but it is a reminder that the world that ended in 2077 was not, despite its retro-futuristic aesthetics and its atoms for peace optimism, a good world. It was a world that had been cruel in many of the ways our own world is cruel, and that cruelty was part of what finally broke it. Mystery 71. The New Plague, a disease that swept the United States in 2053, is one of the more obscure pre-war events in the franchise's timeline, and one that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Hundreds of thousands died. The disease spread rapidly and resisted conventional treatment. The government's response was to establish quarantine zones and restrict population movement. The historical parallel to pandemic disease response in our own world is obvious. What is less obvious, and what the lore hints at without confirming, is whether the new plague was natural or engineered. Given the context of active bioweapons research by multiple state and corporate actors in the Fallout universe's pre-war period, the possibility that the new plague was an escaped or deployed experimental agent is one that sits uncomfortably close to plausible. Mystery 72. The 2-hour duration of the Great War is one of those details that becomes more disturbing the longer you think about it. 2 hours, from first launch to cessation. 2 hours for the accumulated military and industrial capacity of multiple nuclear superpowers to expend itself completely. 2 hours between the old world and the wasteland. The people who survived the initial exchange, who were far enough from impact zones, or in shelters, or simply underground at the right moment, had 2 hours of warning before the exchange ended. In that window, some of them made it to vaults. Some of them sheltered in whatever they could find. And some of them were in cars on highways, or in offices on the 40th floor of buildings, or in parks, or in hospitals, or in all the 10,000 ordinary places that people occupy on any ordinary day, and they had no warning at all, and they had no time to do anything but look up. Mystery 73. The question of whether the Great War could have been prevented is one that haunts the franchise's pre-war historical margins. There were people who knew what was coming. There were intelligence agencies and military planners and, evidently, corporate strategists who had war-gamed scenarios and concluded that nuclear exchange was likely or even inevitable. None of them stopped it. Whether that was because they couldn't, because the structural forces driving the conflict were too large for any individual or small group to redirect, or because some of them didn't want to because the group had already arranged their survival and saw no reason to prevent an outcome they were prepared for, is the franchise's central unanswered question. Mystery 74. The Fallout universe's history diverges from ours at some point in the mid-20th century, specifically around the Korean War, after which the two timelines apparently began to produce different technologies, different political structures, and different social forms. The retro-futurist aesthetic of the Fallout world is not nostalgia. It is an alternative history, a world where the 1950s optimism about nuclear technology, about automation, about the American century, was not tempered by the countercultural movements and institutional skepticism of the 60s and 70s the way it was in our history. A world where the atomic age never became complicated, Where the future that technology promised in 1950 continued to be promised, sincerely, through 2077. And where the reckoning, when it came all at once. Mystery 75. One of the more elegant mysteries in the franchise's pre-war lore involves the timing of the vault door closings. The vaults were supposed to open in a coordinated way. A signal would go out, the overseer would initiate the opening protocol, and the community would emerge into a post-war world theoretically ready for their return. The signal never came. Whether this was because the Enclave, which was supposed to send it, simply chose not to because a controlled wasteland population was more useful to them than vault dwellers emerging to rebuild, or because the communication infrastructure necessary to send the signal was destroyed in the exchange, or because no one was left in a position of authority to issue the order, is never made explicit. The vaults opened not because they were supposed to. They opened because, eventually, something went wrong inside them that made staying more dangerous than leaving. Number. Section 8. The player characters. Who are we really? One of the Fallout franchise's most interesting and least examined traditions is the mystery of its player characters. Each game gives you a protagonist with a defined history: a vault dweller, a chosen one, a lone wanderer, a courier, a sole survivor, and then invites you to play them in ways that may or may not align with what their backstory implies. The characters themselves are, in different ways across different games, deliberately opaque. Their inner lives are withheld. Their pasts are partial. And in several cases, there are mysteries surrounding who they are and what they have already done that the games spend considerable time gesturing at without resolving. Mystery 76. The vault dweller of the original Fallout left their vault in 2161. They found the Mariposa military base. They destroyed the Master's plans and saved the wasteland from the Unity. And then, in one of the most quietly devastating endings in video game history, they were exiled. The overseer of Vault 13, recognizing that the vault dweller had become too capable, too changed, too dangerous in the way that people who have seen too much of the world become dangerous to closed communities, sent them away, into a wasteland that they had just saved, without thanks, without a place to go. The vault dweller founded a small community in the Wastes Arroyo and eventually had children and grandchildren and died there. Their journal, excerpted in the intro to Fallout 2, is one of the franchise's most moving pieces of writing. It is the private record of someone who saved the world and was punished for it, and who found a way to be at peace with that, eventually, and who wanted the people who came after them to understand something about what it cost. Mystery 77. The chosen one of Fallout 2 is the vault dweller's direct descendant, their grandchild, born to the tribal community of Arroyo that the vault dweller founded. They set out to find the GECK, the Garden of Eden Creation Kit, a terraforming device that Vault Tech distributed to some vaults as part of an ostensible plan to help rebuild post-war communities. The mystery that runs beneath the Chosen One's journey is the question of what the Vault Dweller's exile means for how we read everything that comes after. The Chosen One saves the wasteland just as their grandparent did. They defeat the Enclave. They survive things that should not be survivable. Is this simply the franchise's logic that player characters are exceptional? Or is there something specific about the Vault Dweller's line about a genetic profile, a psychological makeup, a resilience that the Vault program itself produced, and that the wasteland then tested to its limit that explains why this family keeps being the ones who matter? Mystery 78. The Lone Wanderer of Fallout 3 has one of the most legible backstories in the franchise. You play through their childhood and adolescence in Vault 101 before the game's events begin. You know their father, you understand their relationships in the vault. But the mystery of the Lone Wanderer begins after the game ends. Whatever ending you choose, whatever choices you make about Project Purity and the fate of the Capital Wasteland, the Lone Wanderer's subsequent life is entirely unmarked in the franchise's canon. The Broken Steel DLC extends the story past the game's original ending, but the character's ultimate fate, what they did with the next 50 years of their life, what the Capital Wasteland looked like as a result of their choices, is left entirely open. They are the most fully realized player character in the franchise in some ways. And then they vanish. Mystery 79. The Courier of Fallout New Vegas begins the game having already done something significant. They accepted a delivery job that someone cared enough about to try to kill them for. Benny, the man who shot them and left them in a shallow grave outside Goodsprings, wanted the platinum chip they were carrying badly enough to commit murder. The courier survived a bullet in the head, survived burial, survived coming back to consciousness in a small-town doctor's house with 200 years of history swirling around them. What made them choose that delivery? The courier's history before the opening of New Vegas is deliberately fragmentary. They have skills and knowledge that suggest extensive experience. They have references in their background to past events in other parts of the wasteland. One specific dialogue option suggests the courier knows the Mojave from before, has been through this territory, has history here that predates the events of the game. But none of it is anchored. None of it is confirmed. The courier is a person-shaped question mark pointed at the biggest decisions in the Mojave's history, and what they were before the bullet is one of the most carefully maintained mysteries in the franchise. Mystery 80. There is a theory in the Fallout community, supported by hints in the Lonesome Road DLC, that the courier had a past life before New Vegas that involved choices and events of consequence. Ulysses, the DLC's antagonist and the one who turned down the platinum chip job that the courier then accepted, refers to the courier with a weight that implies he sees them as a person of historical significance, not just a random messenger, someone who has already, before the game begins, shaped events. The implication that the courier's existence as a delivery person for the Mojave Express was itself a kind of self-imposed anonymity that they were hiding from a past in plain sight, dressed as an ordinary person doing an ordinary job, gives the character a depth that the main game gestures at and the DLC expands without fully explaining. Mystery 81. The sole survivor of Fallout 4 is the franchise's most straightforwardly tragic player character. A pre-war person with a pre-war family. A spouse, a child, a home, all of which are now gone before the game begins. 200 years have passed. Everything and everyone they knew is ash. The emotional weight of that situation is enormous. But the mystery that runs beneath it is the question of who the sole survivor was before the bombs fell. They were a military veteran. They lived in a comfortable suburban house in Sanctuary Hills. They had a spouse and a child and a robot and a commuter life and neighbors who waved from driveways. But they also have, depending on your dialogue choices, a past that is more complicated. Hints of harder experience. Moments where the sole survivor knows things that comfortable suburban life does not typically produce knowledge of. The gap between the surface biography and the implied depth of the character is never entirely closed. Mystery 82. The mysterious stranger. Not a player character, but a character who appears in relation to the player character across every game in the franchise, deserves extended attention here because he is one of the franchise's most durable mysteries. He first appears in Fallout 1. He appears in Fallout 2, in Fallout 3, in New Vegas, in Fallout 4, in Fallout 76. Always the same. A man in a trench coat and fedora, armed with a distinctive .44 Magnum revolver, appearing during combat at a critical moment to fire a shot that changes the outcome of the encounter, and then vanishing before you can speak to him. He is never explained. He never explains himself. Nick Valentine in Fallout 4 has an open file on him, has been cataloging his appearances, trying to identify him, and has gotten nowhere. The Lonesome Drifter in New Vegas says his father was a mysterious man who was a stranger to his own family. The Drifter carries a weapon that plays the same guitar chord as the stranger's signature. The implication that the mysterious stranger has a son, that he has a life, that he is a person with a history rather than simply a recurring mechanic, is the closest the franchise has come to giving him a shape. Mystery 83. The theory that the mysterious stranger is connected to the Mark Twain story of the same name, where the title character is revealed to be Satan's nephew, is one of the more literary fan theories in the fandom, and one that fits the franchise's aesthetic better than it might initially seem. The Fallout universe is a world where God, if he exists, presided over the total destruction of human civilization, where the normal moral ledger does not balance, where an entity who provides decisive assistance to people fighting for survival against impossible odds, and who cannot be killed or captured or spoken to, and who has been doing this since before any of the game's events began, such an entity would be impossible to categorize within conventional moral frameworks. The mysterious stranger may be exactly what he appears to be, a force for a certain kind of justice in a world where justice has no institutional home. Or he may be something else entirely, something older than the waste. Number section, 9 factions, cults, and hidden groups. The wasteland is full of organizations that did not exist before the bombs fell, and would not have been possible in a world where the old institutions still functioned. The collapse of the old order created a space enormous, unconstrained, profoundly dangerous for new ways of organizing people to emerge. Some of what emerged is recognizable, some of it is not. Mystery 84. The Children of Adam are the franchise's most recurring religious faction, and their theology is one of the more coherent worldviews in the wasteland, which is disturbing in its own way. The Children of Adam worship nuclear radiation as the emanation of the divine. They regard atomic bombs as the instruments of God's will, delivered in the moment of the Great War. They believe that radiation does not kill, or rather, that what looks like death from the outside is actually a fission event, a splitting of the self into a new and purer form of being. Their most devout members are often highly irradiated ghouls who have interpreted their own transformation as proof of Adam's blessing. The theology is internally consistent and draws on genuine human needs: the need for meaning in catastrophe, the need for community, the need for a framework that makes the worst things that have happened into something other than simply terrible. It is the franchise's most honest engagement with why people believe what they believe under extreme conditions. Mystery 85. The Children of Adam in Far Harbor, the island DLC for Fallout 4, represent a more dangerous and more organized version of the faction than you typically encounter in the Commonwealth. They have a militarized structure. They have a weapon of mass destruction. They have a theological sophistication that has moved past simple worship into something that looks like planning. The mystery at the center of the Far Harbor story is whether the Children of Adam's settlement there can coexist with the island's other communities, or whether their presence is inherently incompatible with peaceful coexistence. The game offers you multiple endings, including one where the island survives and the factions find a fragile accommodation. But the theological logic of the Children of Adam, their belief that spreading Adam's influence is a sacred duty, makes any permanent peace with them feel structurally unstable. Mystery 86. The New California Republic is the franchise's most detailed attempt at imagining what a functional post-war democratic government would look like, and its story across Fallout 2 and Fallout New Vegas is the story of what happens when democratic institutions encounter the frontier conditions of the wasteland. The NCR has a Congress, it has elections, it has a currency and a bureaucracy and a Bill of Rights. It also has an expansionist foreign policy, a military that sometimes acts with impunity at a great distance from civilian oversight, a corporate class that has captured significant portions of its legislative process, and a water and resource problem that is existential and that its political class cannot address without losing power. It is recognizable in ways that are uncomfortable. The mystery of the NCR is not whether it will survive, it is whether survival is possible without becoming the thing it was supposed to be an alternative to. Mystery 87. Caesar's Legion in Fallout New Vegas is one of the most debated factions in the franchise, partly because it is so deliberately unpleasant, and partly because its founder, Edward Sallow, who renamed himself Caesar, is one of the more intellectually interesting villains in the series. Sallow was a scholar before he became a conqueror. He read history. He understood or believed he understood the lessons that Roman history had for post-war social organization. His argument that the wasteland needs a strong, unified, militarized civilization to replace the chaos of fragmented tribes and raider gangs, and that the brutal efficiency of Roman-style conquest is the fastest path to that unification, is presented by the game as genuinely reasoned rather than simply evil. You can disagree with Caesar. You can argue with him. He is capable of arguing back. The mystery is whether the game wants you to engage with his argument or simply recognize it as rationalizing cruelty. The answer is probably both. Mystery 88. The railroad is structured in ways that suggest its founders understood they were creating something that would be hunted. The cell structure, the coded messages, the use of pseudonyms, the physical separation of operational branches, these are characteristics of clandestine resistance organizations throughout history. But who designed those structures? And on what model? The railroad's operational sophistication implies either a very specific founding vision or a very long period of organizational learning. And the question of how the railroad identifies new members, how it finds people in the wasteland who are sympathetic to synth liberation and careful enough to be trusted with the organization's secrets, is one that the game gestures at without fully elaborating. Mystery 89. The followers of the Apocalypse, most prominently featured in Fallout New Vegas, represent one of the franchise's most consistently admirable factions. A non-combat organization focused on education, medicine, and the preservation of pre-war knowledge for the benefit of the wasteland's general population, rather than any specific political project. Their existence is quietly revolutionary in a franchise whose politics often orbit around control of resources and military power. The mystery of the followers is why they have survived as long as they have, given that they do not fight, do not hoard resources, and do not seek political power. Their survival in a wasteland that tends to punish exactly those qualities suggests that their presence is genuinely valued by enough of the wasteland's population to provide a kind of informal protection. People protect things they benefit from. Mystery 90. The Powder Gangers of Fallout New Vegas began as prisoners employed by the NCR to build a railroad through the Mojave. When their guards were killed in an ambush by escaped convicts, the remaining prisoners seized the opportunity and broke free. They are, depending on where you find them and what they are doing when you find them, anything from chaotic raiders to desperate people trying to survive the consequences of a situation they did not entirely choose. The mystery at the edge of their existence is what would have happened to them if the railroad had been completed, if the NCR's labor project had reached its conclusion and the prisoners had been released, or reincarcerated, or something else. The wasteland is full of people whose circumstances were determined by events larger than themselves. The Powder Gangers are one of the more honest depictions of how that works. Mystery 91. The Enclave remnants in New Vegas, specifically those gathered together by Arcade Ganon's personal quest, represent a strand of Fallout lore that deserves more exploration than it usually receives. The question of what ideological reform looks like within a corrupt institution. These are people who served the Enclave, who believed in what they were doing, and who at some point, at various different points, through various different mechanisms, stopped believing, or started believing something else. The process of that change, the specific internal journey that takes someone from committed ideologue to disillusioned veteran, is what Arcade's storyline is quietly about. And the question it leaves open is whether those individual changes of conscience, multiplied across enough people, can eventually change the institution they came from. Mystery 92. The Gunners of Fallout 4 are one of the franchise's more enigmatic factions, a well-organized, well-equipped mercenary force operating across the Commonwealth, with what appears to be a genuine organizational structure and a clear profit motive. They are not raiders. They have ranks, they have contracts, they have discipline, in the sense that their violence is directed rather than random. The mystery of the Gunners is who is hiring them, and for what. Their presence at specific locations in the Commonwealth sometimes suggests they are there in someone's service. Their equipment, military grade, consistently maintained, suggests they have a supply chain and financial backing that goes beyond simple raiding. Someone is funding the Gunners. The game never tells you who. Mystery 93. The cult of the Mothman in Fallout 76 predates the Great War. They were operating before the bombs fell, conducting secret meetings in the basement of a tourist museum in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, performing rituals and interpreting Mothman sightings as divine omens. The Mothman itself, in real-world Appalachian folklore, appeared in 1966 and 67, and was associated with the Silver Bridge disaster of 1967. In the Fallout universe, the cult formed around a creature that may or may not be what it appears to be, a mutated organism of uncertain origin, whose biology and behavior do not conform to the standard Fallout framework for radiation mutations. The question of whether the Mothman is a divine figure as the cult believes, a government experiment, a creature of the same eldritch lineage as Ugg Qualtoth and the Interloper, or something else entirely, is one of the franchise's more open-ended mysteries. Mystery 94. The Atom Cats of Fallout 4 are one of the franchise's lighter factions, a hot rod gang built around a love of power armor customization, operating in the Commonwealth without any particular ideological agenda beyond their aesthetic and their community. They are disarming and charming precisely because they are doing what people have always done when the world gets difficult, finding a subculture and building an identity inside it. But their presence raises a question that the game does not address directly. In a world where power armor is one of the most significant military assets available, how does a civilian gang maintain a collection of it without being absorbed or destroyed by the larger military factions? The Atom Cats have survived as an independent entity in the Commonwealth, despite having assets that the Brotherhood of Steel and the Institute both have reasons to want. Either they are protected by someone whose power the game does not disclose, or they are simply lucky in ways that the franchise's history suggests will eventually run out. Number. Section 10 Time, Technology, and Unanswered Questions. The Fallout universe is deeply interested in time, in what 200 years does to the things people built and the institutions they created and the ideologies they committed to, in whether anything from before the war is worth preserving, in whether the future that is being built in the wasteland is going to repeat the mistakes that produce the wasteland, or find a way to be something different. These are not small questions, and the franchise earned significant credit for asking them consistently across 25 years of games. Mystery 95, the GECK Garden of Eden Creation Kit, is one of the franchise's most powerful and most ambiguous devices. In Fallout 2, the Vault Dwellers' village of Arroyo was supposed to have received one. The quest of the Chosen One is to find it and use it to save their community. The GECK, as described, is a terraforming device, a package of technology designed to allow a small group of vault dwellers to transform a section of irradiated wasteland into viable agricultural land. In Fallout 3, the GECK that the Lone Wanderer searches for turns out to be the power source for Project Purity, the Clean Water Initiative. The device is versatile. It is also mysterious in its origins, who designed it, what the full extent of its capabilities is, and whether all GECKs are identical, or whether different vaults receive different versions calibrated to different purposes, are questions the lore leaves open. Mystery 96, Project Purity. James's effort to restore clean water to the capital wasteland is one of Fallout 3's most emotionally legible storylines, and one of the most instructive in terms of what the franchise thinks about idealism. James spent most of his adult life trying to build a device that would purify enough water to genuinely change the conditions of life in the wasteland. His dream was real and his methods were sound, and the obstacles he faced were both institutional and personal. What is interesting is not the project itself, but what happens to it when it is achieved, or rather, when the capacity to achieve it becomes a leverage point. Clean water as a weapon, or as a resource controlled by a faction with an agenda, is a more complex and more interesting object than clean water as a gift. Project Purity succeeded, and in succeeding became something that required moral choices about access and control, that James, as the idealistic scientist who imagined it, probably never fully worked through. Mystery 97. The Pip-Boy, the wrist-mounted computer that serves as the player's interface across most of the franchise, is one of the Fallout universe's most pervasive technologies, and also one of the most underexplained. Pip-Boys are issued to Vault Dwellers. They contain maps and data and communication systems and health monitors. They also appear to be essentially indestructible. Yours survives the same things you survive. And in 200 years of wasteland conditions, functioning Pip-Boys are still regularly encountered. Who manufactured them? Vault Tech, in conjunction with Robco. But the manufacturing process for a device that complex, and the question of how they were produced in sufficient quantity to supply every vault, and whether any Pip-Boy manufacturing capacity survived the Great War, are all questions the lore has never fully addressed. Mystery 98. The Nuka-Cola Corporation is the Fallout universe's most recognizable brand, and the lore surrounding it is dense and strange. Nuka-Cola Quantum. The glowing blue variant is revealed to contain small amounts of strontium-90, a mildly radioactive isotope, as part of its luminescence formula. The Nuka World DLC for Fallout 4 expands the Nuka-Cola universe into a genuine corporate horror story, with research into additional flavors that were shelved before the war because their side effects were too severe to market. The mystery at the center of the Nuka-Cola lore is whether any of this was intentional, whether the corporation was experimenting with its consumer base the same way Vault Tech was experimenting with its vault dwellers, using the distribution network of the world's most popular beverage to gather data on population-level physiological responses to chemical additives. Mystery 99. The Robco Institute Mr. House's company, the corporation responsible for the Pip-Boy, the Protectrons, the Mr. Handys, the Securitrons, and most of the franchise's recognizable robot technologies, is the single most consequential corporation in the Fallout universe in terms of the physical infrastructure that survives the Great War and continues to function. Robco products are everywhere. They are functional 200 years after the bombs fell. They have shaped the material conditions of the post-war world more than almost any other pre-war institution. And Mr. House himself, the founder of Robco, still alive, his consciousness maintained in a life support system beneath the Lucky 38 casino in Las Vegas, is one of the few pre-war people who genuinely understands the technology that now defines the wasteland. The mystery of Mr. House is whether his vision for New Vegas and for the future of human civilization is as wise as he believes it to be, or whether he is a brilliant man who has been alone with his own intellect for so long that he has stopped being able to accurately assess his own blind spots. Mystery 100. The Vault Tech Workshop, the Fallout 4 DLC set in the incomplete Vault 88 beneath the Commonwealth, reveals something interesting about the Vault program's manufacturing process. Not all of the vaults were finished when the war started. Vault 88 was under construction when the bombs fell. Its overseer was inside it. The experiment it was designed for was never initiated because the population it was supposed to contain never arrived. What the DLC asks is, what happens to a space designed as a social experiment when there is no experimentee? The answer it gives is, it becomes a space where the player can conduct their own experiments, which is either playful meta-commentary or a disturbing acknowledgement that the impulse to experiment on people is not unique to Vault-Tec. Mystery 101. The question of how much the wasteland has actually changed in 200 years is one the franchise circles around without directly addressing. The Fallout 1 Vault Dweller walked through a wasteland in 2161. The sole survivor walks through the Commonwealth in 2287. That is 126 years between the two games. And the wasteland in Fallout 4 is not radically different from the wasteland in Fallout 1. There are more settlements, there is more organization in some areas, but the fundamental conditions of life have not dramatically improved for most people. The franchise's implicit argument seems to be that the wasteland's conditions are self-perpetuating, that the cycles of raider violence and resource scarcity and institutional failure that characterize post-war life are resistant to improvement in ways that 200 years of human effort has not been sufficient to address. The question is whether this is a comment on human nature or on the specific circumstances of the post-war world. Whether the wasteland could be different, with the right choices and the right circumstances, or whether something in its conditions makes the current state of affairs effectively permanent. Number. Section 11 Easter eggs, developer secrets, and meta-mysteries. Every Fallout game is also, on a meta level, a document of the people who made it. Their references, their preoccupations, their sense of humor, their frustrations, their sense of what is important. The Easter eggs and developer secrets scattered across the franchise are not just jokes, they are evidence of the human beings behind the machinery of a 25-year creative project, leaving traces of themselves in the work. Mystery 102. The Mysterious Stranger's theme music, that specific guitar riff that plays when he appears, is one of the franchise's most immediately recognizable audio cues. It evokes spaghetti western cinema in a way that is entirely deliberate. Ennio Morricone's scores for Leone's westerns are the most obvious reference point. But the specific guitar chord is unique, and it has been present in versions of this music across multiple composers and multiple games and multiple engine transitions. The question of who originally wrote that specific riff, and whether its preservation across the franchise was deliberate or a kind of organic institutional memory, is one of those small mysteries about process that is probably unanswerable but pleasant to think about. Mystery 103. The Special System, the character attribute framework that has defined the franchise across all of its mainline entries, stands for strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck. The inclusion of luck as a primary stat rather than a secondary modifier is unusual in RPG design and reflects something about the philosophical assumptions embedded in the franchise's mechanics. Luck in the Fallout universe is not just a modifier, it is a force. The Mysterious Stranger appears more frequently when your luck is high. Critical hits are more likely. Random events bend toward favorable outcomes. The franchise is suggesting that luck is a real property of people, not just a statistical average, and that some individuals genuinely attract better outcomes than others, which is a deeply interesting mechanical expression of a metaphysical claim. Mystery 104. The Fallout 3 location known as the Dunwich Building was not the only piece of Lovecraftian content Bethesda embedded in the game. The Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. becomes Underworld. The Ghoul community contains exhibits that reference deep time, that gesture toward the idea of an Earth existing for billions of years before human civilization, in ways that feel deliberately placed next to the Dunwich Building's eldritch implications. Bethesda seemed to be building something in Fallout 3 that would connect cosmic horror with post-war horror in a sustained way. Whether they intended to develop that connection further and simply didn't, or whether the fragments we have are all they ever planned, is one of the franchise's development mysteries. Mystery 105. The Herald character, the Ghoul who appears in Fallout 1, Fallout 2, and Fallout 3 is the franchise's longest-running single returning character, and his arc across the 3 games is one of the more melancholy threads in its history. Harold has a tree growing out of his head. The tree, which he named Bob, started as a small sprout and has grown across the years to the point that, in Fallout 3, Harold is rooted to the ground in a forest east of the capital, the tree having spread outward from him into a miraculous grove of plant life growing in the wasteland. Harold has been alive for over 100 years by the time of Fallout 3. He is tired. He has been carrying Bob since his exposure to FEV during an expedition to the Mariposa military base with a scientist named Gray, the same Gray who would eventually become the Master. Harold and the Master were both transformed by the same exposure. One became a god. One became a garden. The contrast is so precise it feels like it must be intentional. Mystery 106. The Ink Spots, the real-world vocal group whose music features prominently across the franchise, appear as a musical choice that seems, on the surface, simply atmospheric. Their sound is unmistakably 1940s American. Close harmonies, melancholy undertones, a polished surface over a complicated depth. I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire. The song most associated with the franchise is, if you listen to its lyrics carefully, about love and about the limits of love and about what you are willing to giving up for someone. Playing over footage of nuclear devastation, it operates as irony but also as genuine pathos. The franchise's use of pre-war pop music is consistently doing more than one thing at once, creating atmosphere, providing irony, and occasionally in specific song choices, at specific moments in specific games, saying something directly about what the wasteland has destroyed and what has survived. Mystery 107. The Sunset Sarsaparilla Mystery from Fallout New Vegas, the quest that involves collecting star bottle caps and eventually revealing the legend of Festus, the robot deputy, and the treasure buried by a long-dead prospector is the franchise's most sustained engagement with the mythology of the American West and one of its most quietly devastating punchlines. You collect the bottle caps, you solve the mystery. The treasure turns out to be human. The franchise is interested in the specific kind of violence that optimism enables, the way that the promise of reward, the promise that persistence will be repaid, keeps people moving through conditions that should stop them. The courier chasing Festus's treasure is doing what the courier does, following something valuable through a world that will try to kill them for it. Mystery 108. The presence of aliens in the Fallout universe, established definitively by the Mothership Zeta DLC for Fallout 3, is one of the more contentious additions to the franchise's lore. Some fans argue it represents a coherent expansion of the universe's atomic age aesthetic, which drew heavily on 1950s UFO mythology. Others argue that the alien presence undermines the franchise's core concern with the human causes of the Great War. The specific theory that aliens were responsible for the Great War, a reading supported by some evidence in Mothership Zeta, would radically change the moral weight of everything else in the franchise, removing human agency from the catastrophe that defines it. The lore is careful, officially, to avoid confirming this, but the alien presence is real, documented, extensive. Whatever they are doing above the Earth, whatever has been happening in that ship for decades or centuries, is a story the franchise has never told and may never tell. Mystery 109. The Vault Boy. The cheerful, thumbs-up mascot of Vault-Tec and the franchise itself is one of gaming's most recognizable brand images. He appears on everything. He is the franchise's face in the same way that a corporate logo is the face of a company. And like a corporate logo, if you look at him long enough, he becomes strange. He is a smiling figure in a blue jumpsuit giving you a thumbs up in the middle of the apocalypse. His cheerfulness is the cheerfulness of propaganda. His optimism is the optimism of an institution that built sealed communities to study the breaking points of human beings and marketed them as shelters. He is, in a very specific sense, the franchise's central image, something that looks like reassurance and is underneath something much colder. Mystery 110. The franchise's recurring motif, war. War never changes. Is the opening line of every mainline Fallout game from the first through the fourth. Its repetition across different narrators and different contexts and different historical moments does different things each time. In the first game, it is a statement of historical pessimism. In New Vegas, delivered by Ron Perlman against the specific backdrop of the Mojave's many competing factions, it becomes something more complicated, an acknowledgement that the wasteland has not produced something new so much as reproduced, in miniature and with limited resources, the same conflicts that destroyed the old world. In Fallout 4, the line is delivered by the sole survivor for the first time, by the player character themselves rather than an external narrator, and the effect is a kind of complicity, an implication that you, the player, already know this and are about to do it anyway. Number. Section 12. Fan theories that changed everything. The Fallout fandom is one of the most intellectually active communities in video game culture, and that intellectual activity has produced theories that are sometimes more coherent and more emotionally satisfying than anything in the official lore. Some of these theories have been so widely adopted that they function as de facto canon in how fans discuss and understand the franchise. Some of them are almost certainly wrong, but are fascinating in ways that say something true about what the games are doing. Mystery 111. The theory that the sole survivor of Fallout 4 is not the biological parent of Sean, that the person who was frozen in Vault 111 had already been replaced by a synth before the events of the game begin, and that the emotional investment you feel as a player toward finding your son is itself part of an Institute experiment, is probably the darkest and most destabilizing theory in the franchise fandom. The evidence for it is circumstantial but accumulates. The synth component that can be found on bodies in suspicious locations, the Institute's documented practice of replacing people with synthetic copies, the emotional manipulability of a character who wakes up after 200 years with the single drive to find their child. If the sole survivor is a synth, if the person you play as is already the thing the game asks you to have an opinion about, then every choice you make in the Commonwealth is being observed by the people who made you and assigned you this mission. The game does not confirm this theory. The game also does not rule it out. Mystery 112. The theory that the lone wanderer of Fallout 3 is the mysterious stranger, that the events of the game represent the origin story of the character who appears across the franchise, helping player characters in critical moments is one of the most structurally elegant theories in the fandom. The lone wanderer's ultimate fate is unmarked in the canon. They emerge from Vault 101, save the capital wasteland, and then the game ends. The theory proposes that they spent the following years building the legend, and eventually becoming the figure in the trench coat and fedora who appears and disappears in moments of need. The lonesome drifter's parentage in New Vegas, the implication that the mysterious stranger has a child he was a stranger to fits with a reading of the lone wanderer as someone who eventually found it impossible to settle, to stay, to be a parent in any conventional sense, after everything they had been through. Mystery 113. The theory that the Vault Dweller's bloodline is the Fallout franchise's actual main character, that the Vault Dweller, the Chosen One, and the Courier are all part of the same biological line, and that something in their genetics produces the specific combination of resilience and capability that allows each of them to reshape the wasteland around them, is one of the fandom's most persistent organizing narratives. The Vault Dweller's Canteen, a unique item that appears in New Vegas as part of the Classic Pack, is cited as evidence that the Courier has a connection to Vault 13 specifically. The theory cannot be confirmed without the franchise explicitly addressing it, but it gives coherence to something that might otherwise seem like a narrative coincidence. The fact that the most important person in every major regional crisis in the wasteland always turns out to be one person, alone, without institutional backing, who arrived from outside and turned everything over. Mystery 114. The theory that Nick Valentine, the synth detective companion in Fallout 4, is actually the original Nick Valentine, not a copy. That when the Institute created the Nick Valentine synth from the memories of the pre-war detective, something went wrong or something went very right, and what they produced was not a synth running a simulation of Nick Valentine, but something closer to a continuation. That Nick's sense of being out of time, his grief, his attachment to Jenny's memory, His detective instincts, these are not programmed approximations, but genuine survivals of something real. The franchise itself leaves this ambiguous. Nick describes himself as a machine with a dead man's memories. But the gap between that description and the experience of spending time with him is large enough to plant a genuine question about what the difference between a machine with a dead man's memories and a dead man in a machine actually amounts to. Mystery 115. The theory that the entire Fallout universe is a simulation that the world destroyed in 2077 was itself a constructed environment, and that the vaults and the experiments and the wasteland and the player characters navigating it are all part of a larger observational structure, is the franchise's most maximally destabilizing theory and probably its least useful. But it earns a mention because it reflects something real about how the franchise is constructed. The fact that Vault Tech's experiments and the player's experience of playing a Fallout game are structurally identical. In both cases, you are a person in an enclosed environment being tested. In both cases, someone outside the environment is observing the data you produce. In both cases, there is an implicit question about whether what you choose matters and what it says about you. The theory is probably wrong as a literal interpretation of the franchise's cosmology. As a description of what it feels like to play these games, it is more accurate than it should be. Mystery 116. The Mr. New Vegas theory that Mr. New Vegas, the personable AI host of Radio New Vegas and Fallout New Vegas, is actually Mr. House's first and most successful attempt at creating an artificial consciousness, predating his own self-transfer to the Lucky 38 systems, is one of the fandom's more obscure and more satisfying theories. Mr. New Vegas knows things he should not have access to. He reports on the courier's activities in real time, which implies surveillance infrastructure or data access beyond ordinary radio broadcasting. His warmth and personality are consistent with a sophisticated AI mimicking human social patterns. And the specific pleasure he takes in his work, the genuine seeming enthusiasm for music and news, and the company of his listening audience is either a very good program or something that has been running long enough to develop actual preferences. House created Mr. House. It is not implausible that he also created Mr. New Vegas, and that his masterwork in artificial personality preceded his masterwork in personal survival. Mystery 117. The theory that the courier of Fallout New Vegas was once a member of the Legion or the NCR, or some other major wasteland faction before some event or decision required them to disappear into the anonymity of the Mojave Express, is supported by fragments of dialogue and the sheer expertise the courier displays in areas that delivery work alone does not explain. The specific skills and knowledge that can be unlocked through dialogue options, the courier's familiarity with Legion tactics, with NCR military protocols, with explosives and medicine and scientific equipment suggests a past that goes well beyond Courier 6's official resume. Whatever the courier was before they accepted the platinum chip job, it was something more than a messenger. And whoever they were running from, or toward, or simply away from, the shallow grave outside Goodsprings was not where their story was supposed to end. Mystery 118. The theory that the Fallout universe's divergence from our own history was not accidental, that the specific technological and social choices that differentiated the Fallout timeline from ours were the result of deliberate intervention by some entity or organization that wanted the world to develop in a specific direction, is one of the more science-fictional theories in the franchise fandom. The idea that a shadow organization, even deeper and older than the Enclave, was steering human history toward the conditions that would eventually produce the Vault program and the Great War, and that the Wasteland is not an accident, but the completion of a very long plan, gives the franchise's history a shape that is coherent and deeply unsettling. There is no direct evidence for this in the games. There is also nothing that definitively rules it out. Mystery 119. The theory that the Mothman and the Interloper of Fallout 76, and the entity buried beneath the Dunwich Borers of Fallout 4, and the Ugg Qualtoth of the Dunwich Building and Point Lookout are all facets of the same phenomenon, that there is a single eldritch presence in the Fallout universe, older than the world that destroyed itself in 2077, that has been reaching toward the surface across multiple games and multiple locations and multiple cultish expressions, and that the Great War may have been the event that made the world thin enough in the right places for it to begin to emerge, is the franchise's most consistently developed meta-mystery. Each game adds a piece. None of them provides a conclusion. The franchise may be building towards something, or it may be maintaining a productive ambiguity that allows each installment to use the thread without being obligated to resolve it. Either way, the something beneath everything reading of Fallout is one of its most atmospheric and its most genuinely frightening. Mystery 120. The final theory, and perhaps the one that says the most about what the franchise is ultimately doing, is this: that war never changed, but something else could. That the wasteland, terrible as it is, brutal as its conditions are, deeply as the old world sins are embedded in its landscape, is also a space where something genuinely new is possible, where a faction that did not exist before could decide to be something that history has never produced, where a person who woke up 200 years after everything they knew was destroyed could make choices that are not predetermined by the forces that created them. The franchise is sometimes read as nihilistic, war never changes, as a statement of hopelessness. But every one of these games ends with the possibility, however fragile, of something different. The Vault Dweller saved a village. The Chosen One freed a people. The Lone Wanderer gave a wasteland clean water. The Courier shaped the future of an entire region according to whatever vision they carried. The sole survivor decided, however incompletely, what kind of commonwealth they wanted to be part of. War never changes, but people might. That is the franchise's quiet, stubborn argument. That is what it has been building for 25 years, and more than 200 theories, and more than 10,000 hours of irradiated landscape, and the soft, persistent hope of a world trying to figure out how to be better than the one it replaced. And that is enough to close your eyes on, I think. That is enough to carry you somewhere quieter. Number. Section 13. The Deep Lore of New Vegas, the Mojave's Hidden Architecture. Fallout New Vegas is the franchise's most densely written game. Developed by Obsidian Entertainment on an engine they inherited and a timeline so compressed that it borders on the unreasonable, New Vegas produced more richly layered lore per square foot of wasteland than almost anything before or after it. The Mojave is a world built on top of a world, every faction, every location, every named character operating at the intersection of at least 2 or 3 competing histories that the game trusts you to piece together. Mystery 121. The history of the NCR's westward expansion into the Mojave is one of the game's most important contextual facts, and one that the game almost never explains directly. By the time of New Vegas, the NCR has been pushing east and south from California for decades, following the flow of trade and resources toward the one thing the wasteland needs more than anything else: Hoover Dam. The dam is not just a source of electricity. It is the central fact of Mojave economics, the leverage point that whoever controls it uses to define everyone else's conditions. The NCR's desire to control the dam is straightforward. What is less straightforward is the cost at which they have pursued it: the diplomatic erosion, the military overextension, the taxation of settlements that supported them and are now questioning that support. The NCR of New Vegas is not a villain. It is something more interesting: a democratic institution that has become its own worst enemy, making the choices that institutions make when they grow larger than the values that created them. Mystery 122. Mr. House is the Mojave's most fascinating character study precisely because he was right about almost everything, and it made him monstrous. He predicted the Great War. He took steps to protect Las Vegas from the nuclear exchange, the platinum chip, the Securitrons, the defensive systems that detonated missiles before they reached the city. His predictions were accurate to within 3 days of the actual date. Las Vegas, New Vegas survived, the Strip survived, and Mr. House, sealed in his life support pod beneath the Lucky 38, survived with it. For over 200 years, he has been planning for the moment when New Vegas would be strong enough to become something independent of both the NCR and the Legion. His plan involves the Courier. Whether his plan is good, whether the New Vegas he envisions is worth building, is the central political question of the game, and it does not have a clean answer. Mystery 123. The platinum chip that the Courier is supposed to deliver is, at its core, a software update for Mr. House's Securitron army. The fully upgraded Securitrons beneath the Fort Fortification Hill, the old volcano at the border of NCR and Legion territory, represent an army that would decisively shift the balance of power in the Mojave in House's favor. Benny wanted the chip because he thought he could use it to depose House and take control of New Vegas for himself. His plan involved Yes Man, a reprogrammed Securitron, and a degree of political ambition that consistently outpaced his actual strategic acumen. The Platinum chip is the MacGuffin of New Vegas and also its most important object, a data storage device no larger than a coin that holds the future of the Mojave inside it. The mystery of who designed the chip, and specifically what the update was designed to do that the previous version of the Securitron software could not, is one that lore enthusiasts have spent considerable time unpacking. Mystery 124. Vault 11's sacrifice mechanic, covered briefly in the Vault section, deserves extended consideration here in the context of New Vegas's broader political themes. The game uses Vault 11 as a compressed history of how democratic institutions can be manipulated into committing atrocities. The residents voted on who to sacrifice. The vote was democratic. The outcome was murder. And the logic that sustained the murder for 75 years? The logic that if we do not do this, we will all die, is the same logic that the game's surface factions use to justify their worst behavior. The NCR uses it to justify annexation. The Legion uses it to justify slavery. House uses it to justify his 2-century hermitage and his refusal to involve himself in the conditions of the people living above him. The Vault is a laboratory version of the choices the surface factions make on a larger scale. Refusing the sacrifice was always the right answer. The question the game asks is why it took 75 years to refuse, and whether the people above ground will figure that out any faster. Mystery 125. The fate of the NCR's Shady Sands capital is one of the franchise's most significant recent retcons, established by the Fallout television series. Shady Sands, a city established in the events of the original Fallout 2, had grown by the time of the TV show into the NCR's largest and most developed city. It was destroyed. The show does not, in its first season, reveal the precise mechanics of its destruction, but it reveals the timing. Within the last few decades of the show's setting, meaning the city that represented the NCR's great achievement was already gone before the show begins. The implications for the political situation of the Mojave in New Vegas, where the NCR is still a major power, and for the timeline connecting the show to the games, are significant and still being worked through by the fandom. Mystery 126. Ulysses, the Lonesome Road DLC's primary figure, is one of the franchise's most carefully constructed antagonists. He is a man who used to believe in things and was stripped of his beliefs by the specific catastrophe of the Divide, for which he blames the Courier. His ideology, such as it is shaped by what he lost. The old flags, the old symbols, the idea that the marks people leave on the world mean something. He carries a Legion flag, even though he is not Legion, because the flag is old and stands for an idea of coherent civilization that has otherwise disappeared. He carries it not out of loyalty but out of grief. The Courier destroyed the Divide without knowing it. Ulysses carries that destruction like a wound. And the resolution of the DLC, whether you kill him, or convince him to stand down, or even recruit him to your side, is the franchise's most emotionally precise engagement with the question of what you owe someone for damage you caused without intending to. Mystery 127. Dead Money introduces Elijah, the former Brotherhood of Steel elder, who was consumed by his obsession with the Sierra Madre's technology, and the Cloud, and the Ghost People, and the casino's untouched treasure. Elijah is one of the franchise's most articulate villains because his obsession is articulate. He genuinely believes that the Sierra Madre's technology represents a paradigm shift for the wasteland, that the Cloud can be weaponized, and the villa's automated systems can be replicated across the landscape, effectively ending the conditions of scarcity that make the wasteland's violence inevitable. He is wrong about whether his methods are acceptable. He may not be entirely wrong about the technology. The mystery of Elijah is the question that runs through all of the franchise's scientist antagonists. At what point does the genuine promise of a technology justify the harm done in pursuing it? The game's answer, through the shape of its narrative, is never. But the game also leaves Elijah's specific analysis of the Sierra Madre's potential just plausible enough to itch. Mystery 128. The relationship between Boone and his wife Carla, the story of how she was taken by slavers, and what Boone did when he found her, is one of New Vegas's most quietly devastating character histories. Boone was a 1st Recon sniper, one of the NCR's most elite soldiers. He followed a trail across the Mojave and found Carla at the fort, about to be forced into Legion service. He asked her to step outside. She did. He shot her. He has been in Novak ever since, sitting in the dinosaur's mouth at night with his rifle, looking for something he cannot name. The mystery of Boone is not what he did. The game is remarkably direct about that. The mystery is what he is trying to do now. Whether the Legion officer he eventually hunts down and kills in his personal quest provides anything he could call closure. Whether the person who does a thing like that, who makes a decision that cannot be unmade, out of love and out of the specific horror of the alternative, can find a way to continue. Mystery 129. Veronica Santangelo, the Brotherhood of Steel scribe companion, carries a question through the entirety of New Vegas that the game never entirely resolves. Can you stay loyal to an institution you disagree with? And what is the cost of choosing to? Veronica is brilliant and capable and deeply aware of the Brotherhood's failures, its insularity, its technological hoarding, its inability to adapt to changed circumstances. She has pushed within Brotherhood channels for reform. She has been consistently ignored or overruled, and she stays anyway, because the Brotherhood is the only community she has ever belonged to, and because there is a difference between knowing that a community is wrong about specific things and knowing that you can survive without it. The resolution of her personal quest, which the game allows to go either direction, toward reforming the Brotherhood or leaving it, is one of the franchise's most humanly observed moments. Mystery 130. The Yes Man ending of New Vegas. The one where the courier takes over the Mojave for themselves, eliminating both the NCR and the Legion and House and declaring New Vegas independent under their own governance, is the ending the game offers as the wild card, the one the game itself designed specifically because no other ending system had a catch-all for the player who refused all available institutional options. It is also, on reflection, the most interesting ending, a single person armed with a reprogrammed Securitron deciding unilaterally what the future of a region looks like. Yes, man will do whatever the courier says. He will agree with them on everything. He will execute their vision without criticism or correction. And the game does not tell you whether that is freedom or whether it is the most sophisticated form of the same problem the game has been examining throughout. The question of what happens when one individual's will becomes unchecked. Section 14. The Human Cost. Stories inside the stories. Every Fallout game is, at scale, about civilizations and ideologies and the forces that shape history. But scattered through every one of them, in terminals and holotapes and journals and the arrangements of objects in rooms where people once lived, are the smaller stories. The individual human beings inside the large events. These are the ones that linger. Mystery 131. The Museum of Technology in Fallout 3 contains, alongside its exhibits about pre-war scientific achievement, a children's scavenger hunt that was apparently in progress on the day the bombs fell. You can find the clue sheets. They are dated October 23, 2077. The children who were working on the scavenger hunt that morning never finished it. The museum has stood empty for 200 years. The clue sheets are still there. This is the kind of detail that the franchise drops without comment, small, specific, aching, and leaves you to sit with. Mystery 132. In the Capital Wasteland, there is a location called Andale, where two families live in apparent normalcy, manicured lawns, a street with actual functioning mailboxes, residents who greet you with suburban pleasantness. The mystery that the location builds towards slowly, through overheard conversations and locked doors, is that the two families have been surviving in the wasteland for generations by eating the people who pass through. The horror is not the violence, but the cheerfulness, the way the social rituals of pre-war suburban life have been maintained as a skin over something that has nothing to do with their original purpose. It is the franchise's most efficient deployment of the uncanny. Mystery 133. The Pit. The Fallout 3 DLC set in the ruins of Pittsburgh builds its central moral question around a single character, Marie, the infant daughter of Vernher and Sandra, who may or may not be immune to the Trog mutation that afflicts most of the Pit's enslaved population. Asher, the slaver baron who controls the Pit, needs Marie's immunity to find a cure that would stabilize his city's population and make a functioning civilization possible. The slaves need Marie to escape, and the courier, the lone wanderer, here has to decide whose need takes priority. The mystery is not what choice you make. The mystery is what the game is saying by making both choices defensible, by constructing a situation where you can be genuinely uncertain, in retrospect, whether you chose correctly. Mystery 134. The testimony of the Vault 11 sacrificial computer, the recording that plays when the Vault's population finally refuses to sacrifice another resident and the automated systems respond, is read in the game, against the silence of a vault where almost everyone is already dead. The recording tells the survivors that they have completed the experiment successfully, that the experiment was always to find a group of people who would refuse, that their refusal, when it came, was the correct answer. The game gives you this information in the ruins of a place where it came too late to matter. That timing is the franchise's characteristic move, truth arriving after the moment when it could have been useful. Mystery 135. The holotapes left by Captain Zhao aboard the Yangtze, the sunken Chinese submarine in Boston Harbor, are among the most melancholy documents in Fallout 4. Zhao has been waiting in his submarine for over 200 years, unable to surface, unable to leave. His crew dead, his mission long irrelevant. His holotapes document the years passing in a submarine where the silence eventually becomes indistinguishable from peace. He is not particularly angry. He is not heroic. He is simply a man who outlived his purpose and his country and his crew, and kept on breathing anyway, one day at a time, in the dark beneath the harbor, because stopping did not occur to him. When you find him, he asks for your help getting home. He wants to go back to China. He has been waiting 200 years to go home. The fact that the China he remembers no longer exists, that the country whose uniform he wears and whose name he carries is ash, like everything else, is something the game trusts you to think about without saying it directly. Mystery 136. The Silver Shroud quest in Fallout 4 is built around the fiction of a pre-war radio serial character, a costumed vigilante in the pulp detective tradition, and it invites you to embody that character, speaking his lines and wearing his costume and dispensing his justice in the ruins of his creator's city. The emotional depth of the quest comes from Hancock, the ghoulified mayor of Goodneighbor, who loves the Shroud's fiction with genuine, unguarded enthusiasm, and from Kent Connolly, the older ghoul who curates the serial's surviving recordings in memory of a world that produced them. The franchise's most consistent emotional argument is about the things people love and carry and preserve, even in conditions that make love and preservation seem impractical. The Silver Shroud quest is one of its clearest expressions of that argument. Mystery 137. Nick Valentine's notebook, which you can find in his office in Fallout 4, contains case notes from his work as a detective since the game's events began. These notes include the open file on the mysterious stranger, the detail of a synth who is also a detective, who maintains case files, who is pursuing an ongoing investigation into the one recurring figure in the franchise who cannot be explained, is one of Fallout 4's most understated pieces of world building. Nick is trying to understand the mysterious stranger the same way he tries to understand everything else. Through evidence, through logic, through the patient accumulation of facts. The stranger is resistant to that methodology, which may be the point. Mystery 138. The story of the overseer of Vault 81, the one who sabotaged the medical experiments to protect her residents, is told entirely through terminal entries that most players never find. Her name was Julia Masters. She had a crisis of conscience in the 23rd year of the Vault's operation when she was instructed to begin the dosing protocol. She could not do it. She falsified records. She rerouted the experimental compounds to the animal sublevels, and she spent the rest of her life in the Vault maintaining the fiction that the experiment was proceeding as planned, knowing that her superiors could never check on her because the Vault's isolation was total. She died in the Vault, of natural causes, surrounded by the community she had protected. The game never makes her a quest character. You find out about her entirely by reading. Mystery 139. The Children of the Wasteland. The various communities of young people raised entirely post-war, who have no memory of the old world, no nostalgia for what was lost, no grief for the civilization that ended before they were born, are perhaps the franchise's most underexplored demographic. Almost every storyline in every Fallout game is shaped by adults who remember before or are defined by the gap between before and now. The children who have no before who grew up in this world and think of it as simply the world experienced the wasteland differently, they do not mourn the old structures. They are not trying to rebuild what existed. They are, in some cases, building things that have never existed. The franchise gestures at this occasionally, in specific characters and specific communities, but has not yet centered a story entirely on what the post-apocalyptic generation is making of the world they inherited. Mystery 140. The ending of Fallout 2, the specific epilogue slides that play based on your choices across the game, is the franchise's most comprehensive engagement with the question of consequences over time. The slides describe what happened to every major location and character in the years following the Chosen One's defeat of the Enclave. Which communities survived, which collapsed, which changed in ways you did and did not intend. The cumulative effect is one of the most emotionally complete experiences in the series, the sense that what you did mattered, that the wasteland you walked through was changed by how you walked through it, and that the consequences of those changes continued to ripple outward long after your involvement ended. The mystery is whether the games that followed, which have sometimes contradicted or ignored the implications of those endings, understood what they were doing when they decided to. Number. Section 15. The future of the wasteland. What comes next? The Fallout franchise is not finished. New games are coming. The television series has introduced new viewers and new narrative threads. The world of the franchise is actively expanding in ways that will eventually answer some of the questions this script has raised and probably produce new questions in their place. Mystery 141. The fate of the NCR in the decades between New Vegas and the television series is one of the franchise's most actively discussed open questions. The show reveals that Shady Sands, the NCR's capital, was destroyed. The manner of its destruction and the identity of the agent responsible are left, in the show's first season, deliberately unclear. The political implications for the Mojave, where, in the events of New Vegas, the NCR was one of two dominant military powers, are enormous. Whether the NCR survived the fall of its capital in any coherent form, and in what shape, is something the franchise is clearly building toward addressing. Mystery 142. The shows reveal that Vault-Tec may have initiated the Great War raises. In retrospect, the question of what the pre-war scenes we have been given across every game have been getting wrong. If the catastrophe was not an exchange between two nations, but a unilateral initiation by a third party using both of them as cover, then the pre-war United States and China are, in some sense, both victims, manipulated into a conflict that someone else had already prepared to survive. What does that do to the moral weight of the Enclave's claim to be the continuation of the legitimate United States government? If the United States was manipulated into destroying itself, then the pure American leadership the Enclave is preserving is in some sense the leadership of a country that was used and discarded by a corporation it trusted, which makes the Enclave's ideology not just monstrous but also, in a specific way, pathetic. Mystery 143. The television series has introduced a character, the Ghoul, Cooper Howard, played with remarkable specificity, who was a pre-war person and has now spent over 200 years in the wasteland, maintaining a kind of coherence through pharmaceutical intervention and sheer will. What the show is building with Cooper, the exploration of what 200 years of survival without community does to a person's relationship to their own values, is one of the franchise's most ambitious narrative experiments. The Cooper Howard who existed before the bombs fell was a man who believed in certain things. The Ghoul he became has spent 2 centuries in conditions that tested every one of those beliefs and found most of them inadequate. What he is now, and what he is becoming, and whether any of what made him Cooper Howard has survived, these are questions the show is asking slowly and carefully. Mystery 144. Fallout 5 has been announced by Bethesda as their next major project following The Elder Scrolls 6. The franchise's history suggests it will be set in a new region of the post-war United States, introducing a new set of factions and a new player character and a new set of regional mysteries to unravel. The question of what threads from across the franchise's history Fallout 5 will choose to pull on whether it will continue to develop the Lovecraftian undernarrative, whether it will address the fate of the NCR and the Mojave, whether it will engage with the implications of the television series Revelations, is one that the fandom is actively speculating about. The franchise has shown, across its history, a willingness to let questions remain open across multiple installments and then answer them in ways that recontextualize everything before. Whatever Fallout 5 turns out to be, it will almost certainly produce new questions alongside its answers. Mystery 145. The Children of Adam's future. specifically the question of whether their theology will eventually intersect with the eldritch entity narrative in a meaningful way, is one of the threads the franchise has been laying down for multiple installments without connecting. The children of Adam worship radiation as the emanation of a divine intelligence. The eldritch entities apparently connected across the franchise seem to be associated with specific forms of radiation or radiation-adjacent energy. Whether the children of Adam are, in some sense, right? Whether the intelligence they are worshipping has an actual correlate in the franchise's metaphysics is a question that Fallout 76 came very close to answering and then stepped back from. A future installment could choose to answer it decisively, or to continue the franchise's tradition of productive ambiguity. Mystery 146. The question of whether the wasteland will ever meaningfully recover, whether the franchise's world will reach, within the timeline of the games, a point where the fundamental conditions of post-war life are substantially better for most people than they are now, is one that the franchise's structural pessimism has consistently resisted answering affirmatively. Each game's ending contains hope. Each game's starting conditions suggest that the hope did not fully materialize. The franchise's argument that war never changes is also, potentially, an argument that the wasteland never changes, that the specific combination of conditions that produce violence and scarcity and institutional failure are durable enough to outlast any individual intervention. The counter-argument, the one that the most optimistic readings of the franchise's endings support, is that change is possible, is happening, just slowly, at a pace that human experience has difficulty perceiving in the moment. Mystery 147. The Followers of the Apocalypse. The peaceful, educational, non-political faction that has appeared in multiple games as a kind of moral counterweight to the franchise's military factions represent a question about whether the wasteland's conditions can be changed without violence. Their persistence across 2 centuries of post-war history, in conditions that consistently punish non-violence, suggests that something about what they provide is valued enough to protect them. Whether that model knowledge, medicine, education freely shared is the thing that eventually shifts the wasteland's conditions in meaningful ways is something the franchise has never addressed directly. It might be its most important unexplored story. Mystery 148. The Courier's Ultimate Fate. The question the show has been very carefully avoiding is one that the franchise will eventually have to address. The events of New Vegas shaped the Mojave in ways that are still being felt in the show's timeline, which is set roughly 40 years after the game. The Courier made choices that had consequences. Those consequences are visible in the show's landscape. Whether the person who made them is still alive, and in what form, and what they have been doing for 4 decades, is information that the show controls and is choosing not to release. When it does release it, it will recontextualize New Vegas's endings in ways that the fandom has been speculating about for over a decade. Mystery 149. The concept of the shadow of the past is one that the franchise returns to consistently, the idea that the old world, though destroyed, continues to shape the new one in ways that are not always visible. The pre-war corporate and government structures that survived the Great War in various forms, Vault-Tec, the Enclave, Robco, the Brotherhood's military traditions, the FEV research that continues to produce mutations are all, in different ways, the old world's ongoing intervention in the new one. The mystery of the franchise is whether the new world will ever be genuinely new, whether the generation of people who grew up entirely post-war, who have no relationship to the old structures except through ruins and holotapes, will eventually be able to make something that is not simply a reflection of what came before. Whether the weight of pre-war history can be left behind, or whether it is so thoroughly embedded in the landscape and the technology and the biology of the wasteland that there is no way forward that does not pass through it. Mystery 150. The franchise's ultimate mystery, the one underneath all the others, the one that every Vault experiment and every faction war and every individual holotape is building toward, without ever quite reaching, is the simplest and the largest. What does it mean to survive? Not to survive in the sense of continuing to breathe, to eat, to move through the world, but to survive in the sense of remaining yourself, of keeping something intact through conditions that are designed, sometimes literally designed, to break it. Every Vault dweller who walked into an experiment and made it out. Every ghoul who held on to their mind when the radiation took everything else. Every wanderer who crossed the Mojave without letting the Mojave take the last of what they had come in with. The franchise asks this question with every player character it gives you, and the answer is not given. The answer is the playthrough. Number. Section 16. Ambient Mysteries. The details that don't resolve. Fallout's greatest strength as a world-building exercise is its willingness to include things that don't explain themselves. Objects and locations and terminal entries that gesture at something without completing the gesture. Rooms that look like something happened in them but offer no evidence of what. The franchise understands that mystery is most powerful when it is allowed to remain mysterious, when the shape of the unknown is preserved rather than filled in. Mystery 151. There is a terminal in the Corvega assembly plant in Fallout 4, an ordinary factory, making ordinary cars in the years before the war, that contains a record of safety complaints filed by workers about the plant's working conditions. The complaints are dated across a span of years leading up to 2077. Management's responses, also logged, are uniformly dismissive. The last entry in the log is dated October 22, 2077, the day before the bombs fell. A worker has filed a complaint about an unsafe floor surface near one of the assembly stations. Management's response, filed the same day, is, "This concern has been noted and will be addressed at the next available maintenance window." There was never a next available maintenance window. The floor surface was never fixed. The person who filed the complaint, whoever they were, went home that evening and did not come back. The complaint sits in the terminal, logged and unaddressed, in a building that has been ruins for 200 years. Mystery 152. The Faux-For settlement of Spectacle Island. A large, isolated island in the Boston Harbor that can be developed into a settlement contains the wreck of a ship that ran aground on its shoreline sometime before the game's events. The ship's manifest, recoverable from a terminal in the hull, lists a cargo that does not correspond to any known commercial or military purpose. The items on the manifest are eclectic in a way that feels deliberate rather than random. Someone was transporting something, in quantities that suggest purpose, to somewhere that is not identified. The ship never arrived. The cargo presumably still exists somewhere in the harbor. The game offers no quest to follow this thread. It just lets it sit there, unresolved, a mystery that was placed specifically to be found and then to remain open. Mystery 153. The West Tech Research Facility in Fallout 76, the building where the FEV was originally developed before being moved to Mariposa, contains records of the virus's earliest development phases. These records include experiments that predate the Mariposa transfer by years, suggesting that FEV research was underway at West Tech considerably earlier than the franchise's official timeline indicates. The implications that the bioweapons program was further along before the Great War than is generally acknowledged in the lore are ones that the game raises without addressing. The full history of FEV's development, from its earliest iteration to the strain that produced the first supermutants, is one of the franchise's most significant unexplored territories. Mystery 154. The pre-war radio broadcasts that you can find on holotapes throughout the franchise, ordinary programs, news segments, advertisements, music programming occasionally contain details that do not fit the official historical narrative. Specific references to events that the official timeline does not record. Names that appear in these broadcasts and appear nowhere else in the franchise's documented history. Whether these are simple production inconsistencies or deliberate seeding of historical details that have never been explained is one of those questions that the fandom has spent considerable energy on without resolution. The specific broadcasts are cataloged on wikis. The specific details that don't fit are noted. The specific explanations are not forthcoming. Mystery 155. There is a type of location that appears in Fallout 4, small, specific, often easy to miss, that functions as a memorial to a person whose name and story you will never know. A flower arrangement in the ruins of a house. A photograph propped against a broken windowsill. A child's drawing pinned to a corkboard in a school that has been empty for 200 years. These locations are the franchise at its most documentary evidence of specific lives that existed, that mattered to the people who lived them, and that the nuclear exchange made into nothing distinguishable from any other ruin. The franchise does not sentimentalize these details. It places them and moves on. The sentimentality is what you bring to them. And the amount you bring is, I think, some kind of measure of what the franchise means to you. Mystery 156. The Nuka World DLC for Fallout 4 contains, in the backstory of the park's various raider factions, a compacted history of how ordinary people become the kinds of people who run a raider empire. The operators are business people. The pack are performance artists of a specific kind. The disciples are students of cruelty who have turned their education into a theology. None of them started where they ended up. All of them passed through intermediate stages, through moments of choice and circumstance, and the specific pressures of a wasteland that consistently rewards the willingness to use other people as resources. The mystery is not how they became what they are. The mystery is whether, given different circumstances at different moments, any of them could have become something else entirely. Mystery 157. The Automatron DLC introduces a villain, the Mechanist, who has been building an army of robots with the genuine intention of helping the Commonwealth, and whose understanding of the effects of that help is catastrophically wrong. The robots are attacking settlements, people are dying, and the Mechanist, sealed in their bunker, receiving filtered reports through their systems, does not know this is happening. The gap between intention and impact between what the Mechanist is trying to do and what they are actually accomplishing is one of the franchise's most efficient compressions of a point it makes repeatedly across all its games, that the people who cause the most harm are often the ones with the most confident belief that they know what they are doing. Mystery 158. The Cabot House questline in Fallout 4 involves a pre-war family, the Cabots, who have been alive since before the Great War, due to a serum derived from the psychic abilities of a mysterious entity they have been keeping in their basement for 4 centuries. Lorenzo Cabot found an artifact in Arabia in the early 20th century. The artifact did something to him, gave him abilities that are not fully explained, connected him to something that is not identified, and made him simultaneously a danger and a resource. The Cabot family has kept him contained and harvested his abilities for a serum that keeps them all young. The entity or power or force that Lorenzo was connected to, its nature and its origin, and whether it has any connection to the other supernatural elements of the franchise, is never addressed. The Cabot House questline ends, and the mystery of what Lorenzo found in the desert 4 centuries ago remains exactly as open as it was when it began. Mystery 159. The Hubologists of Fallout 2 are the franchise's most explicit satire of a specific real-world religious movement. Their theology, organizational structure, and recruitment practices are closely modeled on Scientology, to a degree that surprised some people when the game was released in 1998. The Hubologists believe that human souls' neuroposine are being weighed down by accumulated spiritual damage from previous lives, and that their techniques can clear this damage and allow people to achieve their full cosmic potential. What makes them interesting, beyond the satire, is that in the wasteland context their promises clarity, purpose, community, a sense of cosmic significance are exactly what a desperate population in terrible conditions would be susceptible to. The Hubologists are not effective, but they are comprehensible in a way that makes their failure more melancholy than funny. Mystery 160. The Giddy-Up Buttercup, the pre-war robotic toy horse that appears throughout the franchise, is one of those objects that accumulates meaning through repetition. It is everywhere. It appears in vaults and in ruins and in empty houses and in wasteland dumps. It is small and colorful and completely non-functional and completely indestructible. It has survived 200 years of nuclear fallout and zero maintenance, and it is still recognizably itself. Still a toy horse. Still the thing that was made to make children happy, still intact in a world where almost nothing else is. The mystery of the Giddy-Up Buttercup is not really a mystery at all. It is a joke that the franchise has been maintaining for 25 years about the durability of small, pointless things compared to the fragility of important ones. Number section 17. The silence between the words. The Fallout franchise communicates enormous amounts of information through silence, through the absence of explanation, through rooms arranged to tell stories without anyone to tell them, through the gaps between what is said and what is meant. The mysteries that this section covers are of a different kind than the lore questions and fan theories of the previous sections. They are the mysteries of tone and implication, of what the franchise is doing when it stops explaining. Mystery 161. The moment in every Fallout game when you first step outside into the wasteland, when the doors open, when the light changes, when the scale of the destruction becomes visible for the first time, is one of the medium's most consistently achieved emotional experiences. It is different in every game. In Fallout 3, it is a narrow canyon that opens onto a dead city. In New Vegas, it is a gas station in the desert and a road leading toward a glow on the horizon. In Fallout 4, it is the ruins of your own neighborhood. The house you walked away from 200 years ago now collapsed into rubble and overgrowth. Each version of this moment is calibrated to produce a specific emotional response that sets the tone for everything that follows. The mystery is not what the moment achieves. The mystery is how. How a game engine and a set of artistic choices and a spatial design produces something that feels like grief or wonder or the weight of history in someone sitting in front of a screen. Mystery 162. The ambient music of the Fallout franchise, particularly Inon Zur's scores for the Bethesda-era games, is one of the most distinctive sonic identities in the medium. The music is simultaneously desolate and hopeful, tonally ambiguous in ways that match the franchise's political ambiguity. It does not tell you how to feel about the wasteland. It maintains a kind of suspended emotional state, melancholy without despair, beauty without reassurance that allows each player's experience to bring its own emotional content. The mystery of how music achieves that kind of tonal ambiguity without collapsing into either pure sadness or false comfort is one that composers spend careers working on. Zur's Fallout scores are among the more successful examples in modern media. Mystery 163. The franchise's recurring visual motif of American iconography in decay, the flag on the pole above the ruins, the Liberty Bell visible through a hole in a collapsed building, the Lincoln Memorial being used as a base by escaped slaves, the Capitol building overrun with super mutants is doing consistent ideological work that the games rarely make explicit. America, as a symbol and an institution, is everywhere in the wasteland. It is fallen. Its symbols persist. The mystery is whether the persistence of the symbols is meant to be read as elegiac, as evidence that something worth mourning was lost, or as critical as evidence that the symbols were always more durable than the values they claim to represent, and that their survival in the wasteland is less comforting than it appears. Mystery 164. The pre-war advertising that appears throughout the franchise, the posters, the billboards, the television commercials, the radio spots is uniformly cheerful and uniformly disconnected from the conditions it is embedded in. The Nuka-Cola girl beams from a corroded metal sign above the ruins of a city. The Vault Boy's thumb is up in a location where no one is alive to see it. This advertising does not become ironic in the franchise's world the way it would in ours. It simply persists, maintaining its original cheerfulness in the absence of the culture that produced it, addressing an audience that no longer exists with a message about a world that no longer is. The mystery of how the franchise uses this juxtaposition, what it is saying, by placing relentless pre-war optimism inside a post-war landscape is one that rewards sustained attention. Mystery 165. The franchise's relationship with humor is one of its most underappreciated qualities. The Fallout games are genuinely funny, not in a way that undercuts the seriousness of their themes, but in a way that coexists with it, that makes the serious things more bearable without making them less serious. The humor is often black, often absurdist, often self-aware, in ways that gesture at the gap between the franchise's world and our own. And it is consistently directed at institutions rather than at individuals, at the corporate language of Vault-Tec, at the bureaucratic pretensions of the Enclave, at the specific idiocies that powerful organizations commit when they have too much confidence and too little accountability. The mystery is whether the franchise's humor and its seriousness are in tension or in equilibrium, whether they are working against each other, or whether the humor is part of what makes the serious argument land. Mystery 166. The ghost towns of the wasteland. The settlements that were clearly populated at some point after the Great War, but are now empty. The signs of habitation present, but the inhabitants gone. No bodies. No explanation, just absence or one of the franchise's more quietly disturbing recurring elements. Every Fallout game has them. Places where people clearly tried to build something and then, at some point, stopped. The absence is more unsettling than ruin because ruin has a cause: violence, fire, collapse. Absence just has an open question. What happened here? Where did everyone go? And the franchise characteristically does not tell you. Mystery 167. The way the franchise handles children is one of its more considered design decisions, and one that most players never consciously notice. Children in the wasteland are, with very few exceptions, invulnerable in the games. You cannot harm them. This is not a lore decision, it is a mechanical one, made by the developers for reasons that have nothing to do with the fiction, but the effect within the fiction is strange. In a world of almost unlimited violence and danger, children persist unharmed. They run through ruins that would kill adults. They inhabit settlements on the front lines of faction conflicts. They are there and they are fine in ways that make no realistic sense. The franchise's implicit position seems to be that childhood is inviolate, that even in the worst possible world, there is something that the world cannot reach. Whether this is wishful thinking or a moral assertion is a question you can spend a long time with. Mystery 168. The franchise's title Fallout operates on multiple levels simultaneously, and the multiplicity is worth sitting with. Fallout is the radioactive particles that fall from the sky after a nuclear explosion. It is also what happens to something when it fails catastrophically, the fallout from a mistake, the consequences that cascade outward from a single wrong decision. And it is, in a very American idiom, what happens between people who can no longer get along, the fallout between two countries, two people, two ideologies. All three meanings are active in the franchise simultaneously. The world of Fallout is a world living in the literal fallout of a nuclear exchange, and the political fallout of the decisions that led to it, and the personal fallout, the grief, the loss, the transformation that 200 years of those conditions have produced in the people trying to live through them. Mystery 169. The franchise's most consistent visual motif is not a specific object or a specific character, but a specific spatial experience. Descent. You go down into vaults. You go underground into institute corridors. You go below Boston into subway tunnels. You go beneath the wasteland's surface into bunkers and mines and basements. The surface is ruins and exposure and wind. The underground is secrets and safety and horror. The franchise's geography consistently places the most important and most terrible things below ground, beneath the surface of the world that the bombs shaped, in the spaces that the war could not reach, and that have been sealed from the consequences of what happened above them. The mystery of what is buried literally and figuratively is the franchise's organizing spatial metaphor. Mystery 170. The Fallout franchise, in its 25-year history, has never directly answered the most basic question its premise raises. What happened to the rest of the world? The games are set exclusively in North America, in California, Nevada, Utah, West Virginia, Washington, D.C., Massachusetts. We have fragments of information about Europe, about China, about the wider world, but we have never been there. We know the resource wars involved Europe and the Middle East. We know China was destroyed in the nuclear exchange. We know that the rest of the world was affected by the fallout, both the literal radioactive kind and the geopolitical kind. But the post-war world outside North America is almost entirely blank space. What rose from the ruins of the old world in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, in South America? The franchise has never said. It may never say. And that blankness, that enormous portion of a destroyed world that exists in the franchise's cosmology but has never been explored, is perhaps its most generous mystery. It is space that belongs, in potential, to future stories that have not yet been written. Number. Appendix. 30 more mysteries to carry you through the night. Because the wasteland never quite lets go. Because there is always one more holotape, one more terminal, one more dark corridor that turns out to contain exactly the detail you needed to make the larger picture suddenly shift into focus. These are the smaller mysteries, the ones that live in corners and margins, the ones that the franchise plants not as major plot threads but as atmosphere, as evidence that the world is larger than any story it tells about itself. Mystery 171. The exact location of the Vault Dwellers' village, Arroyo, has never been precisely mapped onto the real-world geography of Northern California. The game establishes it as a tribal settlement somewhere in the general region, but the specific terrain does not correspond to any identifiable real location. Whether this is a simple artistic decision, the need to place a fictional community without anchoring it too firmly to a real place, or whether the specific vagueness is meaningful, suggesting that Arroyo could be anywhere in the region, is a small mystery that has occupied Fallout cartography enthusiasts for decades. Mystery 172. The overseer of Vault 13, the one who sent the Vault Dweller out to find the water chip and then exiled them upon their return, is never given a name in the first game. He is simply the overseer. His decision to exile the character who saved his community has been analyzed extensively in the fandom, and the consensus interpretation that he feared the Vault Dweller's outside experience would destabilize the Vault's carefully maintained insularity is supported by his own terminal entries. But there is a minority reading that he knew something about what the Vault Dweller had encountered in Mariposa, something about the FEV, something about what exposure to that environment might eventually do, and that his decision was motivated less by fear of social destabilization and more by a specific concern about what the Vault Dweller was carrying home with them. Mystery 173. The Shi of Fallout 2, a community descended from the crew of a Chinese submarine that ran aground on the California coast before the Great War, are one of the franchise's more interesting post-war communities. A group that maintained a distinct cultural identity and a sophisticated organizational structure across 2 centuries of isolation in an unfamiliar country. The Emperor, the AI that serves as the Shi's nominal ruler, is based on the submarine's navigation computer, which has developed over the years into something approaching a governing intelligence. The mystery of how the Shi's specific cultural practices, the blend of pre-war Chinese military culture and post-war California conditions, developed over 200 years into the community you find in Sanis. Francisco is a story the game gestures at through details but never tells directly. Mystery 174. The New Reno of Fallout 2. A city organized around casinos, drug manufacturing, and the competing interests of 4 crime families, is one of the franchise's more baroque creations, and one that raises questions about how a city-scale criminal economy sustains itself in post-war conditions. The Mordino family's jet, the addictive chem that functions as New Reno's primary export, is a technological achievement in its own right. A sophisticated drug manufactured in industrial quantities in the wasteland, using a distribution network that implies organizational complexity far beyond simple raiding. Who supplies the Mordinos with the precursors? What infrastructure supports the production at scale? The game gives you enough to understand the product and the hierarchy without fully explaining the logistics. Mystery 175. Jet's origin, a drug manufactured in the wasteland by the Mordino family in Fallout 2, is complicated by a detail that the game does not highlight and that many players miss. The drug's creation is attributed to Myron, a teenage chemist who works for the Mordinos and who is intensely proud of having invented it. Myron did invent it, but the synthesis he used was based on research that predated him pre-war research into stimulant compounds that he repurposed in the post-war conditions of New Reno. The mystery of what the pre-war research was originally intended to produce, and by whom, is one of those historical threads the game never follows. Mystery 176. The Ghouls of Gecko, the settlement adjacent to a pre-war nuclear power plant in Fallout 2, have built a functioning community around the plant's continued operation, maintaining its systems and drawing power from it decades after the war ended. This is one of the franchise's most quietly optimistic examples of post-war institution building. A group of people that the wasteland generally regards as monsters, maintaining complex technical infrastructure, producing something genuinely valuable for the region, and asking in return only to be left alone. The mystery of Gecko is how they learned to do it, how the specific technical knowledge required to operate a nuclear power plant was preserved and transmitted through the chaos of the post-war decades, across a community that had no institutional backing and no external support. Mystery 177. The Burned Man Joshua Graham, the first legate of Caesar's legion, the man who was defeated at the First Battle of Hoover Dam, and whom Caesar had wrapped in pitch and set on fire and thrown into the Grand Canyon, is one of the franchise's most improbable survivors. He survived. The fire did not kill him. The canyon did not kill him. He walked out, badly burned but alive, and eventually made his way to Zion Canyon in Utah, where he became a kind of violent prophet figure for the New Canaanites, a Mormon remnant community that had survived the war in the American West. The mystery of how Joshua Graham survived is one that the Honest Hearts DLC answers with a combination of physical toughness and faith, and something the game implies but does not state directly, that Graham was not yet done, that there was something he had to finish before the world would let him die. Mystery 178. The specific artifacts that appear in the Sierra Madre DLC, the gold bars, the gala event holotapes, The photographs of pre-war guests who never got to attend the opening tell a story about the world that the bombs interrupted. The Sierra Madre was supposed to be an event as much as a building, a gathering of the most powerful and most celebrated people in the Fallout world's pre-war society, an occasion for the old order to celebrate itself. The specific guest list, reconstructed from fragments across the DLC, includes names that appear in other places in the franchise's history, names connected to organizations and events that the games establish elsewhere. The Sierra Madre's opening was also, in some sense, supposed to be a gathering of the people most responsible for what happened to the world. They never made it. The party never happened. The casino stood empty for 200 years, waiting for an occasion that the bombs made impossible. Mystery 179. The followers' medical corps, the doctors and nurses who travel the wasteland providing care in dangerous and remote locations, are the franchise's most direct engagement with the question of what medicine looks like when there is no institutional support for it. Working without supply chains, without reliable equipment, without the infrastructure that makes modern medicine possible, the followers' medics have developed practices and techniques calibrated to the specific conditions of the wasteland. What they have produced, over decades of practice, is something genuinely post-war rather than simply degraded pre-war medicine. The mystery of the followers' medical tradition, how it developed, what it has learned that the old world did not know, what adaptations it has made that are specific to a world with heavy radiation and mutated organisms and limited sterile environments, is one of the franchise's unexplored territories. Mystery 180. The Star Paladin Cross, a Brotherhood of Steel companion in Fallout 3, has been fighting in the Brotherhood service for longer than most of the franchise's named characters have been alive. Her history with the organization stretches back decades before the events of the game, through battles and campaigns that shaped the Brotherhood's presence in the capital wasteland. The mystery of Cross is not her loyalty, which is total and unquestioning, but her interiority. She is the Brotherhood's living institutional memory, a soldier who has seen the organization make decisions over decades and has continued to serve regardless. What she thinks about those decisions, privately, in the rare moments when she is not being what the Brotherhood needs her to be, is something the game allows you to probe slightly and then pulls back from. Mystery 181. The exact number of Vault-Tec vaults, their locations, and the specific design of each experiment is information that no single source in the franchise fully compiles. Different games introduce different vaults. The television series introduces more. Some vaults have been mentioned in lore but never appeared in a game. Some vaults are known only by number, with no associated information about what their experiment was. The implication of a vault program operating at this scale, 122 facilities, each with its own experiment, spread across the continental United States, is an administrative and logistical infrastructure that far exceeds what any corporation could sustain openly. The sheer organizational complexity of the Vault program is itself evidence of the Enclave's involvement. No private company could have done this alone. Mystery 182. The specific timing of the Vault openings, not the long-term drift of communities eventually leaving their vaults, but the specific moments of first egress, is one that the franchise records inconsistently. Some vaults opened within decades of the Great War. Some stayed sealed for over a century. Some had their seals broken from outside, some opened because internal conditions became untenable, and some remained sealed, or were sealed at some point after an initial opening, in ways that the games record but do not explain. The Vault program's post-war history, the story of what happened to each vault after its experiment ran its course, is a collection of dozens of individual stories that the franchise has only partially told. Mystery 183. The Codsworth companion in Fallout 4, the sole survivor's pre-war Mr. Handy robot, who has been waiting in the ruins of Sanctuary Hills for 200 years, is one of the franchise's most straightforwardly moving characters. He maintained the house. He waited. He developed his own processing routines to manage the cognitive challenges of that kind of isolation. He invented things to do. He named the nearby plants. And when you finally appear, 2 centuries after he last saw you, his response is characterized by the specific kind of relief that comes from waiting so long for something that you had almost stopped believing it would happen. The mystery of Codsworth is what sustained him, what in a robot's programming functions like faith, like hope, like the refusal to give up on someone who is very long overdue. Mystery 184. The railroad's use of the Underground Railroad as a naming convention and organizational motif, the deliberate invocation of the pre-Civil War American network that helped enslaved people escape to freedom in the North is a choice that the game makes without spelling out its implications. The synths escaping the Institute are, in the railroad's framework, analogous to enslaved people escaping bondage. The network that helps them is analogous to the people who risk their own safety to provide safe passage. The moral weight of the comparison is enormous, and the game's willingness to make it while simultaneously leaving genuinely open the question of whether synths are people is either admirable or reckless depending on how you read it. Mystery 185. The Fallout universe's version of the Internet, a network of pre-war computing systems called the ARPANET in the franchise's earliest lore, and referenced obliquely across multiple games, was presumably destroyed along with everything else in the nuclear exchange. Or was it? The persistence of functioning pre-war computing infrastructure across the franchise terminals that boot up and maintain files, military networks that still receive and authenticate signals, the Institute's ability to interface with pre-war systems suggests that some portion of the pre-war computing network may still be operational in some form. The question of what information is still stored on that network and what it would mean to access it is one that the franchise has never directly addressed. Mystery 186. The question of whether the franchise's world has a god in any conventional theological sense, beyond the Children of Adam's specific interpretation, is one the franchise declines to answer. There are supernatural elements, as we have discussed. There are entities whose nature is not fully explained by the franchise's internal science. There are moments of apparent coincidence that bend toward narrative shape, but no game has ever stated directly whether the Fallout universe contains a divine intelligence or moral order. The closest approach the franchise makes is through the mysterious stranger, through the persistent presence of something that seems to be trying to help and cannot be explained. Whether that is divinity or simply an unexplained phenomenon is, appropriately, a question that the franchise leaves entirely to you. Mystery 187. The Enclave's President Richardson in Fallout 2, Before You Kill Him, gives a speech about the nature of America and what the Enclave represents that is one of the franchise's most revealing villain monologues. Richardson is not delusional in the way Eden is. He knows exactly what he is and what he is trying to do. He believes in it. He believes that the Enclave represents the best of what America was, and that the best of what America was the specific combination of power, confidence, and indifference to the people who were not considered real Americans is worth preserving and replicating. The horror of Richardson is not that he is wrong about what the Enclave is. It is that he is right about what it represents. The Enclave is a perfect preservation of certain pre-war American values. That is exactly the problem. Mystery 188. The Pip-Boy's map function, which marks every location you discover but leaves vast areas empty until you physically visit them, is a mechanic that doubles as a philosophical statement. The wasteland exists in its full detail regardless of whether you have been there. The people living in the locations you have not yet discovered have been living there for your entire playthrough, doing whatever they do without your involvement. Your Pip-Boy does not create the world. It just shows you what is already there. The mystery of everything outside your current view, all the stories happening without your participation, all the history accumulating in locations you have not yet visited, is one that the franchise maintains across every hour of every playthrough. Mystery 189. The musical tradition that survives in the Fallout wasteland, the country songs and jazz standards and crooner ballads on the radio stations, the occasional wasteland musician you encounter, performing in a bar or a settlement, is one of the franchise's quieter areas of world-building. Music survived. Or rather, recordings survived. The pre-war music that plays on Radio New Vegas and Galaxy News Radio and classical radio is the music that someone chose to preserve, or that happened to survive, in the 200 years since the war. The specific songs that made it through and the specific songs that presumably did not tell a kind of story about what was valued enough to protect and what was considered expendable. The absence of post-war music, original music created in the wasteland, by people who only know the post-war world, is itself significant. The wasteland mostly listens to the old world songs. It has not yet found its own voice. Or it has, and the franchise hasn't shown it to us yet. Mystery 190. The Vault Boy's thumbs-up pose universally read as a positive indicator, as approval, as the franchise's expression of cheerful optimism actually has an alternate reading that lore enthusiasts have noted and that the franchise itself acknowledges in dialogue. A raised thumb, at the correct distance, can be used to measure the extent of a nuclear blast radius. If the thumb fits within the visible edge of the fireball, you are too close. If the thumb obscures it, you may be at a survivable distance. The Vault Boy, in this reading, is not giving you a thumbs up. He is performing a nuclear blast assessment, teaching you the one practical skill you need in a world where the bombs have already fallen. The cheerfulness of his expression, in that context, is either the franchise's blackest joke or the most honest thing it has ever done. Mystery 191. The question of what the sole survivor's child, Sean, the one growing up pre-war, not the elderly father who runs the institute, would have become if the bombs had not fallen, is one of the franchise's most genuinely melancholy counterfactuals. Sean was an infant in 2077. The world that was going to shape him ceased to exist before he was old enough to understand it. The Sean who survived the father, the old man in the Institute, is the product of 200 years of being raised by the Institute's values, in the Institute's isolation, cut off from the family that might have given him something different. What the child who was frozen in Vault 101 would have grown into, in the world that ended, is something that will never be known. Mystery 192. The Deathclaws of the franchise have been shown, in Fallout 4, to be capable of something approaching maternal behavior. Deathclaw mothers protect their nests, their eggs, their hatchlings with a ferocity that goes beyond simple territorial instinct. The implication is that Deathclaws have developed social and emotional behaviors more complex than their engineered origin would suggest. 200 years of wasteland conditions have shaped them as surely as 200 years of wasteland conditions have shaped the human communities around them. The question of whether Deathclaw social organization, the nest-based family unit, the territorial range will continue to develop over subsequent generations into something with greater complexity is one that no game has asked directly. What does a Deathclaw look like in another 200 years if no one interferes with its development? Mystery 193. The super mutant behemoth outside Fenway Park in Fallout 4, one of the first major combat encounters in the game, has been in the Commonwealth long enough that the Minutemen have developed specific tactics for dealing with it. The minigun in the military crate was presumably placed there by someone who had fought the behemoth before and survived and wanted to give the next person a chance. The chain of decisions that led from behemoth appears in the wasteland to someone leaves a minigun in a specific crate so the next person has a fighting chance is a story the game tells entirely through object placement. No terminal entry, no holotape. Just a crate in exactly the right position, and the inference of the human chain that led to it being there. Mystery 194. The Good Springs community in New Vegas, the small settlement where the courier recovers after being shot, is one of the franchise's most functional small communities, and one that the game uses as a demonstration of what sufficient autonomy and sufficient isolation can produce. Good Springs works. It is small, it is quiet, it lacks the drama of larger settlements, but its social fabric is intact, and its residents have a relationship with one another that implies years of accumulated trust. The mystery of Good Springs is what specific combination of factors produce this outcome, rather than the fragmentation and violence that characterizes most wasteland communities of similar size. The answer the game implies is distance, relative peace, and a community that never got large enough to fracture. That is both comforting and sobering, as lessons go. Mystery 195. The followers of the Apocalypse's medical research, specifically their ongoing study of radiation's effects on the human body, has produced, over the decades, knowledge about post-war human biology that did not exist before the war. They have watched bodies adapt to radiation over generations. They have documented mutation patterns. They have developed treatments calibrated to the specific conditions of the wasteland. Whether any of this research has been shared with the broader wasteland community, or whether it sits in follower archives waiting to be found and applied, is one of those questions that the franchise leaves characteristically open. Mystery 196. The election cycle in the NCR, the democratic process, that is, one of the things that distinguishes the NCR from every other major faction in New Vegas, is referenced but never shown. You know elections happen. You know the current president won by a significant margin. You know that the political process involves the kind of maneuvering and compromise and factional pressure that democratic politics always involves. What you do not see is any of it. The NCR's democracy is, in Fallout New Vegas, a claim about an institution rather than a demonstration of one. Whether the democracy the NCR claims to practice corresponds to the democracy it actually practices is one of the questions the game asks of the faction it presents as the most recognizably legitimate. Mystery 197. The specific mechanism by which the forced evolutionary virus creates ghouls in some exposure scenarios and super mutants in others, and why the same FEV exposure seems to produce dramatically different outcomes in different individuals is something the franchise's internal science has never fully resolved. The standard explanation involves dose, exposure time, and pre-existing genetic factors. But the specific variables that determine whether a given FEV exposure will transform a human into a super mutant, or a ghoul, or something entirely different, or nothing at all, are not cataloged anywhere in the franchise's official lore. The possibility that FEV's effects are more dependent on the host's psychological state, on something less tangible than genetics, is one of the franchise's more speculative theories, and one that has no definitive support or refutation. Mystery 198. The question of what Fallout's wasteland smells like is one that the medium is structurally incapable of answering and that the franchise has nonetheless thought about. The lore references the smell of specific locations, the salt and rot of Far Harbor, the sulfur of the pit, the sweetness of Nuka World's collapsed theme park, the specific mineral smell of deep underground bunkers. These olfactory references are placed carefully enough to suggest that the writers were imagining a sensory dimension of the world that the medium can only point at. The wasteland of the Fallout franchise has a smell. You will never smell it. And it is, based on everything the games tell you about it, probably one of the less pleasant aspects of the experience. Mystery 199. The question of children born in the wasteland after the Great War, their specific experience of a world where nuclear war happened before they existed, where radiation is a baseline condition rather than a catastrophe, where the ruins are just architecture and the mutants are just the other kinds of people, is one that the franchise has gestured at without ever centering. What does the wasteland look like to someone who has no before to compare it to? Does the radiation feel like an affront, or does it just feel like weather? Do the ruins feel like a loss, or do they feel like home? The children of the post-apocalypse are already several generations deep. They are the majority of the wasteland's population. Their relationship to the history that made their world is, almost certainly, the most important thing happening in it. And it is the story the franchise has most consistently not told. Mystery 200. The final mystery is the one the franchise has been building toward across all of its games and all of its stories and all of its mysteries. And it is this. What does it mean that we keep coming back to this place? The wasteland is a difficult world. It is violent and bleak and built on layer after layer of betrayal and failure and the accumulated consequences of decisions made by people who prioritize their own survival and power over the survival and well-being of everyone else. It is not a comfortable place to spend time, and yet millions of people have spent hundreds of hours there, have built homes in it, have formed attachments to its characters and factions and locations, have read holotapes and cried over them, have stood in the ruins of Washington, D.C., or the Strip, or the Commonwealth, and felt something that is not exactly sadness and not exactly wonder, but is somewhere between them a recognition, maybe, that the things this world is grappling with are the same things our world is grappling with, dressed in power armor and nuclear fallout and the aesthetics of a future that never quite arrived. The Fallout franchise is a mirror. It is a mirror made of ruin and dark humor and careful attention to what happens to institutions and ideologies and people when the conditions that sustain them fail. And what we see in it is something we recognize, even through the distance of 200 years of fictional history and alternate timelines and monsters created by bioweapons and the persistent cheerfulness of the Vault Boys' raised thumb. We recognize people trying to survive. We recognize communities deciding who they want to be. We recognize institutions choosing power over principle and individuals choosing principle over their own survival. We recognize the question of whether change is possible and the hope, fragile and persistent, that it might be. That recognition is why we keep coming back. That is the mystery that the franchise is really asking. And the answer is whatever you decide to carry back out with you into the real world when the wasteland finally lets you go. Good night.